Will be here around 10.
Thanks, Emily. And Emily Levin is going to be in a car. And she said a colleague would be here. At least for the time being. I don't recall who that was or is.
And Sam, I see that Tristan Brown is joining with you. Is that right?
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Ben Plotzker from Efficiency Vermont will also be participating in the TRM related discussion today.
Right. Okay. Good morning, all, and welcome to the October 17th, 2024 meeting of the Clean Heat Standards Technical Advisory Group. I'm Rick Weston, the chair. With us is Catherine Morris, our facilitator. Welcome all. And there are a number of folks from the public I see. The usual housekeeping to start with. I ask that everyone stay muted unless speaking. Raise your hands. The electronic hand works best. If you'd like to speak, and you will be put in the queue. If you are, I ask that tag members keep their videos on if they can, and other folks keep their videos off until and unless they are speaking. And this way we can get an idea of the, see what the tag are doing and have, focus on the meeting in that way. We have some guests that were just mentioned, Ben Plotzker from EBT, Matthew Bakerpool is here, and Alec will be coming from the DPS. Brian, it's just you from A&R today? He's looking for his buttons, and Tristan Brown's with Sam, as we understand. Okay. Well, great.
And also Nora Travis for NESCOM.
Oh, okay, great.
I was
Nora,
going to jump in. Hi, thanks.
Thank you
for inviting me.
Thank you. Okay, good. Okay, we've got a lot on our agenda today. I'm going to turn the meeting over to Catherine because since we will be having discussions and we'll be doing some polling, so I want to turn the meeting over to a professional facilitator. And with that, take it away, Catherine. I'll hand it over to you.
Well, then I'll do the honors of asking if anybody if everybody's had a chance to review the minutes of the 10-3 meeting, and if you have any edits or changes that you would like to have us consider. All right, can I ask for a motion to approve those minutes? Come on, Brian, you usually help us out.
So moved, I'll move.
There you go. All right. All in favor of approving the minutes? Hands up. Hands down. And all opposed. Okay.
I'm going to
Good.
abstain. Ken Jones.
Ken, yeah, you weren't there. All right. Okay, so I'll turn it then to Deirdre for our PUC updates.
All right, good morning, everybody. So very quickly, just heads up, I'll have to drop off and rejoin this meeting probably pretty soon, just to join an internal commission meeting, but I'll be back. Very quickly, the 3 documents that I personally, shared with the group, or Catherine sent around, just wanted to quickly go over those. So the first one was hopefully expected, the latest round of feedback from Opinion Dynamics. I think it seems to resolve a lot of the questions that the subgroup had, but to keep track of kind of where things are, there were opportunities to invite another round of feedback if tag members or the subgroup would like to. I can kind of point to those if that's helpful. I think, the ones that I flagged are on the last 3 pages. Kind of about the program data tracking recommendations. They invited TAG members to, if you have recommendations on additional data that the program should be tracking, they're willing to kind of provide thoughts on what makes sense, but otherwise we're trying to minimize burden on the implementation team and participants in the program. The next thing about land use change, so the group will talk about this obviously later on in this meeting, but that they clarified they attempted to remove all land use change impacts on all alternative fuel measures in the model, but because GREET is so large and complex, if TAG members spot any where their land use change has been incidentally included, they'd like that to be flagged. On the next page for T&D losses, they just kind of clarified that the T&D values do not account for leakage from the delivery truck's tank, but if TAG has information on the rate of leakage from delivery truck tanks, they can try to incorporate that into TRM assumptions. And then on the final page, a few more potential TAG action items are about terminology for what was before referred to as lumber wood waste. They indicated that GREET uses roundwood to describe timber and asked if that term is more appropriate of the group. And then the final 2 things were about the 4% T&D adder for line losses, and that other studies estimate a higher range. They propose using the 6% average line loss found in the AESC study, but welcome if the TAG has specific suggestion, they welcome feedback on that. And then also requested that the TAG share any available information that the group has on natural gas distribution system loss factors specific to Vermont. So I would just say that those are the opportunities for another round of feedback that I spotted in that memo. But hopefully a lot of those things are resolved. The other memo about their approach to life cycle analysis for wood was a more direct request for feedback. They essentially outlined what the initial approach was, what in the initial emission schedule, what kind of feedback they got both from TAG and from members of the public, and then put forth a revised approach and specifically asked that the TAG weigh in on how the life cycle analysis of wood fuels should be treated and specifically on that revised approach. So that was that second memo. And then the third, there's no direct action item from this document, but really it was, and I was not part of this meeting, but it was a meeting between the PUCR chair and the heads of local community action agencies. And I think it's just a valuable perspective for people doing the work on the ground, for the TAG to keep in consideration when they're weighing in on some of these technical elements about the program. And I think that is the summary of at least the things that were shared from my end. Otherwise, wanted to quickly mention the TRM feedback timeline. So I do apologize, that was a little confusing at the last meeting. I think I maybe didn't appreciate that the second draft on Opinion Dynamics schedule was due at the end of the month, so that they really did need feedback by the 11th to meet that deadline. So I think what we'll do is kind of play it by ear, play it by ear how today's meeting goes, and see if it makes sense to push back their deliverable, their second draft, or to keep on the schedule and to consider the TAG's feedback depending on where this group falls consensus wise, to just keep in consideration for the final draft. So that's where that is. And that'll kind of be flexible then for the next draft of the TRM. And more of a housekeeping reminder, just ask that any resources that individual TAG members want directed to Opinion Dynamics, if you could file those in ePUC, that would be the most helpful, just so this whole group benefits, the public benefits, and they're all kind of in one place, rather than sending them directly. And that goes for members of the public too. I think that there's been some things that have been sent directly and you know, my expectation is that Opinion Dynamics and this group is reviewing comments in the rule docket. So that's where those should go. And then finally, just a reminder that the draft rule is out for public comment until the end of the month. Comments are due November 1st. That does give this group an additional meeting to kind of come to consensus on any group level feedback they have on the rule. And just a reminder that individual tag members can submit comments on their own behalf in the rule docket at any time. So those, I think, are my laundry list. Ken?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that yesterday Commissioner Allen hosted a meeting on the economic impacts of the Clean Heat Standard. And one of the things in the Public Service Department is undertaking an additional effort to review the sort of economic impacts in addition to the work that NV5 has developed. So that, you know, they have about a 7-week timeline on that. So I ask that other tag members try to really stay abreast of that. And the TJ Poore asked that while Department of Public Service is going to be developing some analysis, the Public Service Department is inviting additional analysis to understand the economic impacts of the implementation of the Clean Heat Standard. I think that's a fascinating request. So I will keep others posted to the extent that I may participate in sort of an additional analytic exercise.
Thanks, Ken. Any other questions for Deirdre before we let her off the hook here? All right, thanks, Deirdre. Appreciate it. Okay. So our next portion, let me just give you an overview of how we're going to cover some of the topics today, because we do have a lot to cover in. The first session that we have coming up right now is a session to discuss 3 topics that a subgroup that has been convening between meetings has discussed over the course of at least 2 of their meetings, and have developed proposals for your consideration and vote if everybody feels prepared. So we're going to have a break after we discuss those issues. We're going to see how you're feeling about a vote. We're going to let the public weigh in, and then we will take that vote after the public comments. The next session is more issues that the subgroup has just recently been able to start discussing. We do have some memos that have been developed for your consideration. But this is really these issues that are the first time that you, as the rest of the tag members, have had a chance to fully deliberate. So we want to certainly take into account how we want to use that time to make sure everybody fully understands those issues, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll see how you're feeling about whether or not you're ready to vote. And if not, we can defer that to the next meeting. And then finally, we have some issues that we have not, the subgroup has not talked about at all, but we want to begin that discussion today, if possible, at our meeting today. So that's the 11:55 session. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and dive into the first couple of issues. The first 3 issues we wanted to bring to you are the question about assumptions in the TRM on the heat pump hours of operation, the approach that they've taken on the rate of decline on biofuels CIs over time, particularly between 2030 and 2050, and then the definition of advanced wood. And we have different subgroup members that have been working on those issues, and I want them to first have a chance to present the options and the pros and cons of those options, and then we'll have a discussion on each of them individually. So I'm going to start with Emily Roscoe, because this is probably our quickest and easiest. Emily, do you want to just give a quick overview of this issue and any request of the tag that you have?
Yeah, excuse me, at this point, there's no request of the tag, but I'm happy to give a quick update, and Ben Plotzker or anyone from the department, feel free to jump in. But we had flagged this during the last tag meeting and had a brief check-in during the TRM subgroup meeting around an inconsistency in the clean heat standard TRM, around full load hours for heat pumps savings, and the number we use in calculating savings for heat pumps in EVT and tier 3. So at this point, there's no, I think, vote or request or statement from the tag. We have been in touch with the department to work out this inconsistency, and I think that's the update I have now. Ben or anyone from the department, if you want to add anything, feel free.
Thanks, Emily. I'll
Yeah.
just mention I did meet with both Barry Murphy and Keith Levinson from the department on this matter, and they are in agreement that there should be consistency between this clean heat standard TRM as well as the tier 3 and energy efficiency utility TRM. So we're in agreement, both Efficiency Vermont and the department, to align those, and that the only changes to those hours will be informed by a forthcoming heat pump evaluation that is kicking off this winter.
And I'll just add the detail that alignment in this case means reflecting the existing TRMs in the CHS TRM, at least until that study is completed. At which point, presumably all three would be updated. So that's an effective reduction in heating load hours under the CHS TRM.
Okay, so at least the short-term solution or resolution of that issue is that the Opinion Dynamics will make changes to their assumption to align with the EVT assumptions. Okay.
Correct.
Makes sense. Rick.
Yeah, I just want to confirm, in fact, what Matthew just said. The tier 3 and EVT assumptions are more conservative.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay, you said, and nothing needs to happen at this point, or nothing's going to happen until you, as you say, you kick off the study and finish it, or this work. But it would presumably come back to the tag or a tag for review, and ultimately go to the PUC for approval. Is that right?
That sounds right to me.
Okay, any other questions on that issue? So no tag action being requested. All right, let's move to the next one. This would be the rate of decline of the biofuels carbon intensity over time. And Emily, I know you're in the car. Rick, you also worked on this. How do you want to, who wants to be the spokesperson? Rick, you want to start? Emily, you weigh in?
And Floyd too, I thought, Floyd, right? You were involved. So you may want to speak as well. I don't have the document right in front of me, but we have 3 options to be considered, and there's a discussion about them. The third one is really an alternative, an undetermined alternative, to give folks an opportunity to weigh in on something other than the 2 options.
Would you like me to share the document, Rick, or?
Yeah, I think that'd be great if folks haven't seen it yet. I mean,
Hopefully they have.
yeah.
Okay. Let me see if I can. I don't have 2 screens, so this might not be as large as it typically would be. Let me see if I can get this over here to share.
Yeah, my involvement in the drafting of this was to put together this inchoate third option. I'll turn it to Floyd and Emily to discuss the other options.
Yeah, so can we have somebody just review each of the options and a brief overview of the pros and cons, and then we can have questions.
Floyd, you?
Okay, well, I wasn't, I only commented on certain aspects of it, but yeah, happy to do that. I disagreed from the get-go about the ordering of the options here, so it's a
Well,
minor
let's,
note.
Floyd, let's actually, I would really appreciate it if we could just sort of state each of the options or,
Yeah.
and quickly and
Okay,
rather than
so
debate them right now, we just give a brief description of.
yeah, so one option is to go with the two-stage CI schedule that was in the opinion dynamics write-up.
I don't know if you can hear me.
You're breaking, we heard brief moments. Yeah, we can hear you now, Emily. Hello? Now we can't hear you. All right.
Okay, why don't I just keep going? Emily can chime in when she can. Another option presented here is a linear decline in carbon intensities over time from 2031 to 2050. And then a third option, I think, introduced by Rick was a stepwise decline in carbon intensities. That could be 3, 5, or whatever, rather than the two-stage decline. And then some relevant sections of the clean heat standard were cited here. I do want to point out subsection F2 under section 8127. The verbatim wording is the commission shall establish and publish the rate at which carbon intensity values shall decrease annually for liquid and gaseous clean heat measures. The reason that's important is it doesn't actually direct the commission to say what the direction or the magnitude of that decline can be. So as I think Rick or someone else pointed out later on in the write-up, that decline can be positive, that could be negative, or that could be zero, right? And the zero is where you get the stepwise function or stepwise approach that's outlined in those different options. Okay, why don't we skip down? Okay, so there's some background information here talking about the PUC straw proposal, adopting a step change in the carbon intensity values, no rate of decline between the years. The PUC didn't take a position on how those should decline from 2031 to 2050. And I think the TAG submitted comments on the PUC proposal supporting the step change between 2025 and 2030 and didn't take a position between 2031 and 2050. So really the question in front of this group is what do we do with that that period between 2031 and 2050? So there's some discussion here on statutory interpretation. As I pointed out a few minutes ago, the language from 8127 allows for the rate of change that the PUC would publish to be either negative, positive, or zero, and it can change from year to year. And so, let's see, what else is there? I think there's some discussion about the choice of trajectory, whether that's linear decrease or stepwise, that could have an impact on which fuels are eligible for clean heat credits. I would point out that there's nothing in the statute that calls for a particular phase out of specific fuels. You know, arguably there's some intent there, at least with regard to the carbonaceous fossil fuels, but for alternative fuels and those things that are intended to comply with the regulation, there's nothing in the statute that says, you shall set a schedule of declining targets that will achieve a phase out or, elimination of particular fuels by such and such date. And then let's see, there was some discussion about, how the compliance targets might interact with the achievement of the emission reduction targets under the Global Warming Solutions Act. You know, there's some note here that talks about the linear option offering, the stepwise option offering the least assistance to emission reductions of the three. I guess I would point out that I don't necessarily agree with that, because the stepwise functions can provide incentives for early and substantial reductions, and those would certainly help with achievement of those climate targets. And I'm sorry, I really wasn't prepared to go over this because this wasn't my document, but I think that covers the main elements of it.
Yeah.
Hopefully people have had a chance to read it.
And thank you, Floyd. I'm sorry that I sort of handed the ball off to you without preparing you for it, but thank you very much. That was unfair of me.
So Rick and Emily, I don't know if we have Emily, just any clarifications you want or any additions you want to highlight in the memo before we open it up for questions?
Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, sorry, I'm near Brattleboro, so I have some hope of having reception for a minute. Yeah, that language about the commission shall establish and publish the rate at which carbon intensity values shall decrease annually. I think our debate is whether the publishing is what happens annually or whether the decrease is what happens annually. I would disagree with that the decrease could be an increase.
Emily, you're breaking up. We can no longer understand what you're saying. Matthew.
Yeah, I think I caught what Emily was saying, at least in the first half. And I just want to make a comment that I don't believe we're debating whether or not the publication of the decline rates is annual anymore, because the section immediately following the section that we're discussing says that it's the first intervals of updates for declining carbon intensities are going to happen on a 5-year basis. And then as far as whether or not the rate of annual decline could be a negative rate of decline and therefore be a loosening of the stringency of that requirement, I'll just comment that I think that's an interesting way of reading that section of the Act.
Rick?
Yeah, Matthew, I agree with your interpretation, your reading of the statute. When I went back to take another look at it, I reached the same conclusion. I had suggested in an earlier discussion that it might be more ambiguous, but no, I think that's right. As for the question of rate of decline here, that language is mine. I am not. I put it there to remind people that, in fact, mathematically, you could have a negative rate of decline. You could have a positive rate of decline. I'm not suggesting necessarily that it ought to happen, but I do think as just a strict mathematical matter, that could be the case. Certainly, there's language, in the document that suggests that it seemed, well, to me at least, unlikely that the legislature was intending to constrain the PUC in such a way on this that that there would have to be, positive rates of decline every year. That seemed unlikely to me because for some of the reasons that I put in the document, having to do with the rate of technological change, anticipating what's going to happen, and trying to minimize economic dislocation from setting standards that people can reasonably meet over time. So that's why that language is in there.
Yeah, Floyd.
I just wanted to be clear. I was not suggesting that the standards you know, move in the wrong direction. Okay, so I was agreeing with Rick that mathematically the statute is, you know, a reasonable interpretation of that is positive, negative, or neutral. And in fact, I don't have this section in front of me, but there is language, if I recall, in the statute that basically says the 20% standard, you can go above that if there are, you know, practicality concern or reasons, you know, those sort of, the fuels aren't available, that sort of thing. So the legislature did leave open the possibility that the rate of decline could be something other than positive or even neutral under specified circumstances. So that, I think that's all I was acknowledging.
Thanks. Ken?
Yeah, hopefully for simplification, but I want to offer a fourth option. And that is that we instruct the Public Utility Commission in the year 2029 to establish the rate, the threshold rate of reduction for the next 5 years. Rather than us try to figure it out now, we'll have the Public Utility Commission will have 3 years of experience. And many of the technical issues that you've raised will have greater elucidation. For us to decide that today, I don't think is worthwhile. So I suggest option 4. That is, you could call it punting, but have them make the decision in 2029.
Rick?
I agree with the underlying assumption that you're making, Ken, and that is that this issue doesn't have, in my view, does not have to be determined today or next week or in the next few months, because there is time before the declines actually start. So that is, you know, is that a fourth option, or is that implicit in the third option? I'm with you on that. That would be fine with me. We could add one.
All right. So you're hearing mostly from the subgroup members at this point. I want to make sure that the folks that were not on the subgroup did not, because we've been debating this, they've been debating this for over the course of several lengthy meetings. So wanted to make sure that other individuals that haven't had a chance to weigh in or ask clarifying question get that opportunity now. Any additional questions, or should I assume that all the TAG members present today understand these 3 options and are ready to at least talk about voting, whether they are ready to vote? All right. So let me ask you, I'm going to actually do this in real time, to give me option 4 language. Ken, if we're going to add that.
The PUC determines in 2029 the appropriate rate of reduction for the carbon intensity threshold values for liquid and gaseous biofuels.
For the next 5 years, did you say?
Yeah, for the next 5 years. And I think the statute suggests they do that every 5 years. So it'll be 29, 34, blah, blah, blah. But 2029 is the first stab.
And we would take no position on that at this point.
Yeah, can I make just a slight suggestion for the next 5 years or longer? I mean, long-term certainty certainly helps with market participation and investment. So if that's appropriate for the PUC to consider, I would suggest that.
That's fair.
Okay.
I don't know if you can hear me. I was going to wonder if, does it have to be 5 years or could it be 3 years? Like, to me, and also, do we know it's going to step down every 5 years, or is it totally up in the air and could be held steady?
So I suggested 5 years because I thought the statute talked about revisiting the issue every 5 years. And yes, it could be held steady. I mean, but again, I would hope that the first few years of experience would really add clarity rather than us speculating as to how this thing's going to work out. And I also just want to add, I think a much more important determination in the PUC is the retirement schedule. You know, a liquid or gaseous biofuel that has a fairly high carbon intensity doesn't give you many credits. And so as we get down the road and there's a requirement for a growing number of credits, just the value of these fairly high carbon intensity value biofuels goes down, regardless of the threshold that's established. So I really don't think it's going to be that critical a determination. But again, we'll have experience in knowing that. So yeah, I think this issue really is going to have a lot more behind it in terms of the overall retirement schedule, especially after you get past 2030. Getting to 2030 is going to be hard. Getting past 2030 is going to be harder.
Any other comments regarding option 4 before we make this a formal option?
I think what Ken is suggesting makes a lot of sense. It also makes a lot of sense that we don't tie the PUC. The PUC will make these decisions. Will there be a tag? What will that tag look like? Who will be on it? All these are future casting here about what we're going to look like. So I agree with Ken.
You mean we don't have life appointments to this?
I don't think so. I'm not sure that works that way.
Okay. Well, while we're here, we're not going to vote now, but let me get a sense on if anybody is feeling uncomfortable about taking a tag-wide vote. And let me just make a further clarification on that. What I've suggested to the chair on this process and voting is that we take a vote, we see whether or not there is a strong majority, and Rick has, in his email, suggested that strong majority would be 10 of you taking a singular position. And if not, that we would continue to discuss it and see if the folks that are in the minority have potential ways that they would amend our proposal that would make them feel more comfortable so that we could reach that super majority or whatever you want to call it. And obviously the reasoning for all of this is that we would like, if we're going to take positions as a tag, we'd like to send a message to the PUC that there was, a strong preference. If we can't send a message that there is a strong preference, we basically are just going to be providing them with a summary of our discussion. So it would be something like this memo. It would be, here we discussed these options. We have no position. We have no strong position. The tag was split. So that would be the nature of our voting process. And I'm certainly open for others to suggest other approaches. But Brian, I see your hand up. So why don't we go there first?
Yeah, just a question about process, particularly in this discussion where now there's 4 options. How many votes do we get? And if, how are we determining strong consensus if, there's 2 votes for option 1 and 3 votes for option 2? This was clearer when there was just 2 choices, but now I'm not sure. And now I'm not sure if the process allows for one person, 1 vote, or 1 person, many votes.
1 person, 1 vote. And it sounds like at least we may have to implement some sort of ranked choice voting protocol where we eliminate the choices that don't have much support at all. Yes, it's getting more complicated. Our subsequent votes are more like yes, no, abstain. So that's less complicated. Emily, you have a suggestion?
I don't know how we implement ranked choice voting, but I like that idea conceptually. What I was going to say about option 4 is I'm not completely happy with this language. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I would be potentially open to an option 4 if I don't like the or longer. I think it should be updated at least every 5 years. And I also think there has to be some decline. So I would be open to like a step down every 5 years, but that's not what this says. This leaves the possibility that the step down could be 0, and it also just starts it in 2029, and there's no commitment beyond that. So I just wanted to note that there's sort of, you know, we might be able to continue massaging the language and find some compromise there, I guess. I'm not sure we're quite there yet.
Good. So, well, just on that point, Floyd, I'm wondering how you're feeling about eliminating or longer. I think that's at least one step towards where Emily is going. I think that was your.
I mean, it's a suggestion to improve kind of the long-term certainty of the program. I mean, I'm not going to fall on my sword on that one, but you know, I'll go with the will of the tag on this, on those 2 words.
Well, it sounds like Emily would be more comfortable with this overall if that was removed.
I would not be comfortable if this were removed. I want to keep it. This if we're going to invest in biofuels, we need longer than 5 years.
Yeah.
And if I can, by using the term or longer allows the Public Utility Commission to determine, to kind of absorb Floyd's and Matt's understanding that if it's a 10-year period where technology is being contemplated and invested in, and the PUC recognizes that, then they may want to go longer. Again, this is still 3 years from now, 4 years from now, but they can do 5 years. But if there are good reasons for them to do longer, then they can do longer. So, I mean, I again, by saying or longer, I don't think locks the PUC into, oh yeah, we're going to do 10 years. They'll only do 10 years if there's good reason to do 10 years.
I changed my mind. I will gladly fall on this stunt sword here. So,
well, and may I just clarify that nothing we say is locking the PUC into anything, right? We are
That's right.
Advisory.
That's right.
So this is an advice. It is not locking them into any decision. They could go a completely different direction. So yeah, I want to, can you mind, Rick, if I go back to Emily just to see how she's feeling about this before?
Yeah, I mean, it's moving in a direction that I'm less comfortable with. I'm not comfortable with more than 5 years. I'm also not, the way option 4 is written, it seems like you could just determine it in 2029 and do it once and then maybe never do it again. So I feel like there should be a published schedule out to 2050 with some, stepwise decline every 5 years. Maybe it's very small declines, or even, it's steady for 10 years. That could be part of the schedule, but it does need to, something should be published every 5 years. It just seems to me that the way that option 4 is being edited is basically it leaves open the possibility that it could turn into option 2, which I don't support.
Rick.
I do want to be clear that there are 2 things going on here. One is how often the review occurs, and that's already stated in statute, at least every 5 years. So that no matter what the PUC does, it'll review every 5 years this function, this declining function, or whatever the function is, and it can change it. Okay, it can change it at any time. I don't, as a consequence, I don't find the or longer language problematic, because for the reasons that Matt has stated and the text tries to get at, and that is that you want us, to the extent that you can, and I've been involved in work on this and other emissions rules, to the extent that you can, prescribe goals for technology to achieve, new technology to achieve, and you give manufacturers a meaningful opportunity to achieve those goals. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. So that's why I personally like a 5-year at least a 5-year trajectory and maybe longer so that they know what's coming down the pike. I'll leave it at that.
Brian?
So I'm trying to determine exactly what the difference is between option 3 and option 4, besides option 4 explicitly identifying the PUC as the body that makes this determination, which we all know they already have the authority to do. So who is proposing the alternative rate of decline in option 3? Is it us? And if it's us, then when does that happen?
No, that was just, it's, in the end, it's going to be the PUC making the decision. It doesn't say that the TAG would propose it, but the TAG, of course, is authorized and directed under the statute to advise the PUC on this question.
So what's the difference between 3 and 4?
Well, Ken can weigh in on this. I think they're quite similar myself, but the difference that I immediately see is that it specifically mentions the year 2029 for the first review of this, or the first decision on this.
Yeah, my intent was to not have the current rule that's going to be going to the legislature tackle this issue. It puts it off, to be quite blunt. The option 3 doesn't necessarily do that. It suggests that maybe they need to figure it out between now and the time they do the rule. Option 4 does not. Option 4 says it will not be included in this iteration of the rule.
Okay, thanks.
So Emily, coming back to your discomfort with the way option 4 is written, I'm sensing, oh, there you are. Hey, generally, we've got a lot of support for this additional or longer reference.
Sorry, Rick said that there's already language in the statute that requires the PUC to publish or update something every 5 years.
Yeah, Matthew just read it to us.
That doesn't say anything about 5 years.
Matthew, what was it?
Sets
Did
the
I miss-
first 2 updates. So this is section 8127F2. The commission shall establish and publish the rate at which carbon intensity values shall decrease annually for liquid and gaseous clean heat measures consistent with the previous subdivision as follows. A, on or before January 1st, 2025 for 2025 to 2030. And B, on or before January 1st, 2030 for 2031 to 2050.
Okay.
So the act says that the schedule for post 2030 will cover the period from 31 to 50. But I wouldn't read that as precluding any updates in the interim.
Yeah, I misunderstood that, but I agree with you. I don't think it precludes updates at all.
In fact, a plain read would say it's supposed to decline annually, or maybe publish annually some decline pattern. I guess what I'm trying to expect for us is I'm open to a 3 or 5 year interval here. It doesn't have to decline every single year, but I'm not comfortable with option 4 because I don't think, like Rick, I think you were incorrect that there's not they're not definitely going to return to it every 5 years. I'm also fine not determining the rate of increase right now and punting it like Ken wants to do. Like, I think, it's valid to suggest there would be more information in 2030. I just want to make sure that it declines in some pattern consistently from 2030 to 2050, such that it's not just held steady until 2049 when it jumps down to 20%. Do you know what I mean? And that it is revisited in either a 3-year increment or a 5-year increment at least. So those are my interests. I'm not sure that's compatible with Matt and Floyd's perspective. I think we might be at a bit of an impasse.
Brian. And then I'm gonna just make a proposal.
No, that was from before.
Oh, okay. I'm starting to hear that, at least from the individuals that were on the subgroup that have been most invested in this, that have been most vocal about this, that we are moving towards one option that people feel comfortable with, and that would be option 4. If we could find agreement around the actual language to describe that option. And again, the most contentious issue seems to be the one that Emily has raised, which is how long the schedule would be published for. Just let me check. Are there others that are still feeling strongly that the option 1, linear annual decline, or option 2, the step down, just a singular 2-point step down from 2029 to 2040, or option 3 are still viable and should be considered as we move forward? Anybody want to weigh in on those 3 options any further? Yeah, Brian?
Well, I think we ruled out 1 and 2. I think option 3 is still in play for me.
For you? Okay.
Yeah.
Rick?
I was going to say the same thing. My general feeling here is that I find it unlikely that the PUC can. Well, it may very well, according to the statutory language that Matthew just reread to us, it may very well feel compelled to publish a schedule from 2031 to 2050 that describes in some manner or another declines over that period. But I would find it unlikely that that schedule wouldn't be revisited at some point in the years that follow. So my general feeling is an option that I would be comfortable with, and it sounds like, in my view, both 3 and 4 do this. Retains that authority, implicitly or explicitly for the PUC to review the schedule over time as experience is gained.
Thanks. So we still have 3 and 4 on the table. Luce, how are you feeling about this?
Well, I like the idea of Ken's suggestion, but I have a question. I haven't been involved in this subcommittee. So we're saying, that we're going to see a reduction from 80 to 60, and this might be a question Matt Cota can answer quickly. What does that mean for existing oil boilers? Like, when do we have to transition to a different piece of equipment to make this work? And does that impact our step down?
It really depends on, Luce, this Matt. It really depends on what type of fuel we're going to get, and renewable propane, renewable diesel, biodiesel. Renewable diesel, no, we don't have to change the burners at all, and we're seeing up to 50% of biodiesel blends work with existing equipment, and new equipment that's going in, new burners are going to be all B100 compliant. So I don't see a need for a step down, particularly when we can prove that it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But I don't see an issue with the transitioning to higher and higher blends.
Okay, good, because that was my question. Can the equipment keep up with the step down? Is very important. Okay, thank you.
Ryan, one more comment? I think then we're going to close this up and move on to their next issue.
Yeah, I just based on Luce's question, like, this is just for the eligibility of these fuels as clean heat measures. So the way you asked it and saying, what does this mean for the fuel market? That's really going to be determined by what the annual credit budget's going to be, and less about this. This is a way to get there, but this doesn't apply to fossil fuels at all. It just says if you're going to be doing delivered clean heat measures, it needs to meet these carbon intensities on this schedule as well. So it's related, but it's kind of indirect.
Okay, I thought it was related to number 2 fuel oil.
No, No, this is only for delivered fuels to be eligible as clean heat measures.
Loose,
Which
loose
which is
going on.
biofuels replacing heating oil to oil.
Right. The way this is written, and it is confusing, Luce. These are targets that the biofuels will need to make, and they are denominated as carbon intensity values relative to number 2 fuel oil. So it gets a little, so that's why they're declining. Okay, it does get confusing. I struggled with it for a while.
Okay. So I'm setting this aside for now so we can move on to the next topic. What I take away for voting purposes is option 3 and 4 would be up for a vote. And we'll revisit how comfortable people are with that. And Emily, I'm assuming that leaves you option 3 as something that you would feel more comfortable with given our conversation, but that still leaves option 3 on the table for the vote. All right, stop share.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the interest of oh, I wish you had left that up for a second. In the interest of trying to narrow the window of disagreement, I think Ken's concern with option 3 was that it might imply that the PUC has to decide this all now, and I am willing to, I think it's fine to defer these decisions to 2029 or whenever that is, but I don't like the or longer. Like, option 4 seems too fuzzy for me in terms of like, you could just have like one step down then still.
Okay. All right. Our next topic is the definition of advanced wood heat. And here, Emily, we've got you, and you and Adam worked on this. I can bring this up for folks to look at.
Yeah, I think I'm now in Massachusetts, land of more reliable cell service. So I think I should be okay to talk through this one, but I don't know if Adam Sherman and Nora Travis, my colleague, also helped with this, so others can step in if I lose my reception, but I can get started. But if you could share your screen, that would be great. Why are you going this way?
Okay.
Sorry, my husband just got off the highway and apparently it's to hold our bumper on. Great. So advanced wood heat. So we built on Ken's start on this, but it is much expanded and updated with a lot more specificity. Like, we tried to actually insert definitions, and then option 3 is different. We, I think, agreed based on subgroup discussion to delete option 3, which, as previously written, related to kind of just treating it as a fuel. And we focus, this is, so we reworked this. So the question before the tag is, how should advanced wood heating be defined for the purposes of determining which advanced wood heating installed measures? So again, we're talking about this as an installed measure, not the fuel. There's a whole separate set of issues related to carbon intensity of wood fuels and things like that that's totally separate. But for the installed measures, like which types of wood heating equipment should be considered eligible clean heat measures, eligible to receive credits. So option 1, only fully automated systems, fully automated high efficiency pellet and wood chip boilers and furnaces, so kind of central whole house systems. Option 2, all types of systems and fuels meeting criteria for efficiency and air pollution emissions. And I can walk through these in more detail below, but option 3, which again is a new option, is one that I wanted the tag to consider, which is basically option 2, but with cordwood excluded because of the particulate emissions issues just being kind of unsurmountable. Like, I'll talk about that more. But for the purposes of walking through this, the statutory language is here for reference. If you scroll down, it's, I guess what the tag should be aware of is that essentially the statute just defines advanced wood heating as an eligible clean heat measure, like it's on a long list of eligible clean heat measures, but it doesn't actually define what that means, like which types of equipment should be eligible, and exactly, it doesn't provide any further definition beyond that. So that's where we come in. There is, I would note, some reference to advanced wood heating systems as a type of installed clean heat measure. So there's a reference to this in the LMI section where it's listed among installed measures that have a lifespan of 10 years or more and require capital investment. So again, zoning in on this is an installed measure. So that's kind of it in the statute. So a lot for us to determine. So moving on to kind of the discussion of the options. Option one, this is, Ken had proposed this, and we pulled in some language here from that Adam Sherman shared based on studies that he's done with the department related to the CEDF. Sorry, I've got things popping up here. So we tried to insert some definitions of, so this is fully automated wood heating. So meaning that it's automatically fueled with either wood pellets or chips and can sustain automated operations for several days at a time. That definition would exclude cordwood boilers and furnaces. It's also notable that these have to be indoor systems based on kind of existing definitions for incentive eligibility in the Small Scale Renewable Energy Incentive Program and Efficiency Vermont. There's some additional criteria listed here. So there's criteria for wood chip boilers and furnaces and pellet boilers and furnaces based on high heating value peak efficiency and the amount of particulate emissions per MMBTU. And these criteria are generally consistent with Efficiency Vermont and the SSREIP. Although maybe I'll pause there and see if Adam wants to clarify anything. I think there's some tweaks to the eligibility criteria, possibly.
Yeah, I just point out there is an error in the document. Any reference to a European or EN standard for boilers should be the EN 3035 standard, and any reference to an EN standard regarding stove appliances should be the EN 13240. There is a couple places where boilers are referencing the stove standard. I just want to draw attention to that for folks, and we can get that fixed in the document.
Yeah, we were scrambling.
I changed all of those references to EN 13240, but that's not correct, you're saying?
Correct, that is not correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can correct that. Sorry, we were scrambling to try to get this done in time. If you go down to option 2, that's kind of the all of the above option, except it's all of the above meeting certain criteria for efficiency and emissions. So this would allow both, stoves in addition to pellets. I don't know why this is so small. Stoves in addition to pellets and sorry, I'm losing track here. So this option would allow stoves in addition to boilers and furnaces, and it would allow cordwood as well as pellets and chips. This is consistent if you scroll down a little bit to the eligibility criteria. It's consistent with that correction we need to make to the test methods reference, but this is consistent with the kind of incentive eligibility requirements that Efficiency Vermont has. So Efficiency Vermont, for example, does provide incentives for cordwood stoves meeting these criteria. And then option 3 is, I'll putting on my kind of advocate hat. This is the option that I personally support as on behalf of NESCOM, and Nora can speak to this as well. She's very expert, but I like option 2 in theory. The problem is that there actually is no kind of agreed upon method to understand the emissions for cordwood appliances, both stoves and central systems, it's just kind of a mess. And I'll ask Nora to talk about that a little bit more. But because we don't feel like we have a reliable way to know that a cordwood appliance actually meets a reasonable level of particulate emissions, this option would exclude those. Again, not exclude them in the state of Vermont, but you just wouldn't be able to say a cordwood stove is advanced wood heating for the purposes of being eligible for clean heat credits under the clean heat standard. All the other types of appliances would be eligible as long as they meet those same criteria for emissions and efficiency. And maybe I'll just pause there and ask Nora to weigh in, because Nora, Dr. Nora Travis is an expert in this and has done a lot of this testing herself. Could you just speak to kind of what you found and what EPA has found with respect to cordwood emissions, Nora?
Sure. Thanks, Emily. I just put some links to references in the chat because much of this is pretty recent. But to sum up, essentially, the Inspector General for EPA came out with a report in 2023, essentially saying that wood stove certification tests are unreliable. I mean, just the title itself was pretty shocking. And part of that is, I don't know if folks are familiar with, generally stove testing methods have been, cutting up like very defined pieces of clean lumber and burning at a hot flame. And so the 2 grams per hour limits were based on this test. Almost every single certification test has been revoked other than the NESCOM developed integrated duty cycle protocol, as well as a revised EPA method 28. So what we have found in our research at NESCOM, as well as research done by Brookhaven National Laboratory, is that we have not yet found a cordwood stove that meets a 2 gram per hour certification limit. And in fact, the particulate matter emissions are much higher. In addition to that, we recently, and to Emily's point, this is the research I've been leading, published a paper in Environmental Science Technology Air, which not only looked at particulate matter, but also looked at hazardous air pollutants and carcinogens and things such as formaldehyde and benzene. And that was just published about a month ago. And cordwood was by far significantly higher for all these other air pollutants. So we applied the integrated duty cycle, which uses logs and mimics, when a person comes home from work and they start the stove and then they load the stove and they have an overnight burn. So from a public health standpoint, it's really clear that pellet stoves are far lower emitting for everything. And also there's some research on pellet boilers, not a lot. For the whole home systems, there's not a lot of research. But what is out there supports pellet whole home heating systems, as well as pellet stoves. That is very, very clear from a public health standpoint. It's significant reduction in air pollution. However, there is no such agreement or reduction from any cordwood. So from a scientific standpoint, option 3 allows like pellet stoves, any kind of large home heat pellet system, and kind of leaves like to be determined if cordwood appliances improve in their emissions output. That being said, NESCOM is leading a research effort with EPA funding to assess every single cordwood stove on the market. That's going to take about 5 years. So this could change, and then we could have an understanding of which are best in class and which aren't. But again, that's 5 years out. So again, supporting Emily on the option 3. I realize Nora Travis doesn't have a vote, But I did want to share with you that recent scientific development, and it's all in the chat. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks. So to that, let's see if there are any questions about the three options. I'm going to scroll back up to make sure people have a chance to look at them. Yeah, Luce.
Hi, just a quick question on the pellet stove criteria, because I thought Efficiency Vermont, it was 2 grams per hour. And so was EPA, but we're saying 1.8. So just wondering what that is.
Pellet stoves are generally, we found, under 2 grams per hour and 1.8.
Yeah, I actually put that number in there based on to be legally sold in the US, it has to meet the 2.0 grams per hour, and that is the current EVT standard. But for this to do a better job of distinguishing and delineating between best in class equipment and more run of the mill, that slightly lowering that threshold would build market confidence and policy confidence in the technology when pellet stoves are able to meet that lower standard. So I was the one who interjected that value.
I believe at Efficiency Vermont, it's 2. So if we want to match them, we're not matching them.
Correct.
And so I would suggest we make that 2, so we're all on the same page. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thanks. Matthew?
I just wanted to make a quick comment on sort of the flip side of the same equity coin with respect to particulate emissions and efficiency of equipment and certification testing. The exclusion of cordwood is going to increase costs for a lot of low-income people in Vermont who rely on LIHEAP, and when their LIHEAP funding runs out, they often switch to cordwood. So considering the equity considerations required within the Act, that's something worth at least mentioning.
But it doesn't prohibit them from still relying on cordwood. It just means that cordwood is not eligible for clean heat credits, at least until such time as we can understand the emissions from those units.
Granted.
Thanks.
But I will note that we had some discussion about this and did feel that one benefit of option 3 as opposed to option 1 is that it does at least keep in pellet stoves, which keeps stoves being a more affordable and accessible measure that might also have some widespread equity benefits. And to the extent that we could support people in switching to higher performing pellet stoves from cordwood stoves, that would have significant benefits for their health.
Other questions around these three options for defining advanced wood heat?
Just a comment again, can we keep the same value as Efficiency Vermont? I still don't understand why we arbitrarily picked the 1.8. Maybe Adam can answer that.
I put in the 1.8, just as I said before, because the majority of the pellet stoves on the market already meet that standard, and because 2.0 is the legal minimum, and we're trying to distinguish between best in class and run of the mill.
And I think also Luce may be pointing to it's not ideal to have inconsistency and incentive eligibility across the state. But Adam, do you think efficiency, Adam works with Efficiency Vermont. Is that something EVT would consider doing?
Yeah,
well?
we just haven't caught up with that detail, but yeah, it would be my recommendation to Efficiency Vermont to move to a 1.8 standard for the pellet stove for their program. So we can achieve that alignment. It's just because this is out in front. That's what I recommended.
Yeah, and I guess I would note for the purposes of voting that I'm not sure our intent here is to define exact efficiency and emissions criteria for all time. There should be the ability to update and revisit those for incentive alignment and based on latest information and testing as we go. For example, if we could add cordwood stoves back in the future, these were just provided sort of for reference. So you would sort of have a sense of what we're talking about in terms of eligibility criteria, but maybe there could be some language in here about like, these are sort of illustrative criteria, you know, recommendation to align with incentive programs and keep these updated over time.
Rick?
Yeah, I was just gonna make that same point. As written, the options do not include specified performance standards. So I'm content, and I'm all for performance standards. I'm a big believer in performance standards rather than you know, technology bans per se. So this is fine with me.
Can I just ask a clarification question of Adam? When the number is chosen, Adam, is that for the rebates? Is that something that's in the TRM, something the PUC does, or is that Efficiency Vermont makes that determination that this still qualifies based on their numbers or their analysis?
It's a good question. I don't know 100%. I generally just provide recommendations, and then the Efficiency Vermont program manager implements that. But what process they go through to get the approval to change a performance standard? It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe Emily or anyone else from EVT who might be on the call could answer that better.
The only reason I bring it up is that if PUC is choosing the number, let's stay consistent. Or is Efficiency Vermont, can it unilaterally or, you know, on its own change the number to match whatever comes out of the PUC regarding the clean heat standard?
Ultimately, there's a PUC approval process. DPS is involved. Matthew can speak to this, but EVT can't make, so far as I understand, can't make unilateral decisions like that without regulatory approval.
Ben, are you going to provide clarification on this or raise a different issue? Okay.
Yeah, so my team's in charge of updating the TRM for the energy efficiency utility, and what happened, Adam mentioned it from the start, was the EVT program manager for HVAC and refrigeration would request an update to that, and our team would actually go through updating the TRM to align with those recommendations, and we would present that to the department via our EEU tag. So we do get approval from the department, and in theory they could push back and disallow change, but that would typically be the process. We propose it, they review it, they provide comments, and then it becomes approved and we can implement. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. Jared.
Thank you. Just a comment or two and one question. Overall, you know, I have no real disagreement with the presentation of the options and the health impacts. This kind of forecast the health impacts conversation later in the agenda, but that assessment, you know, basically says that moving from fossil fuels to wood heating generally has negative health impacts in terms of increased particulate matter and other pollutants. So I think this decision here is sort of trying to pick hopefully the one that minimizes those negative impacts. And, you know, option one, I think does that the most, but appreciate option three, opening up additional, you know, pellet stove options for folks that may be a much more accessible option. I do think option two with allowing cordwood would be really hard to defend from a health perspective. And also appreciate Adam's suggestion. If you can navigate some of those other challenges you've been discussing of lowering the criteria for pellet stoves to the 1.8, because that would be better for health than a higher standard. My one question with option three is about the last sentence: cordwood appliances should be excluded until their emissions performance can be determined. And I guess I'd maybe suggest different wording for that. I think it's explained better below, but it, you know, from my perspective, it's not just about determining their emissions performance, but it's that they also meet reasonable criteria that were specified below. Because as far as I know right now, even if we could determine their emissions performance. Every study I've reviewed about real world wood cordwood stove performance, suggests that they pollute at a much higher rate than any of these other options. So even if there was an emissions performance standard, I don't quite see how, I think as Nora said, many could meet that criteria. That seems like a bit of a unicorn. I'd be curious to learn more about. I've seen studies that show that real world performance of cordwood stoves can vary by, the emissions from them can vary by like a factor of 5 to 10, depending on what fuels you're using, or what would you're using, how what the moisture content is, how you're operating your stove. There's a lot of other factors there. So I would maybe want to see a little bit more specificity in the option that we vote upon about meeting certain criteria.
Can you say, Jared, specifically how you would change this last sentence to be more specific?
I think it might just be integrating some of the language from the discussion below that sets those criteria or suggests criteria. I think referring to meeting certain criteria, and I don't know enough about that world. I just defer to the NESCOM folks for the right wording there, but I think it needs to be that there aren't just emission performance standards determined or the emissions performance of stoves determined, but that they're meeting certain criteria. I don't know if my NESCOM colleagues can.
Yeah, well, I would weigh in and say, again, what our studies to date have shown is that, stoves are certified for a certain amount of particulate matter. Let's just keep it to particulate matter to keep it simple. And in our studies to date, we have not found a stove that has come under 2 grams per hour. That does not mean that there's not a cordwood stove out there. This is just based on the research we've done to date, and that the next project that we've already started initializing, which is an independent assessment that literally will look at 300 stoves, will definitely identify whether there are any cordwood appliances on the US market that do meet the 2 grams per hour. So I guess I thought that was implied because that's going to be the pellet, right? That was the pellet particulate matter of 2 grams per hour limit. And the integrated duty cycle does mimic, as much as a lab situation can do, how folks burn wood in their homes. And there's a realistic moisture content range, so it's 20 to 25%. I think people that burn wood appropriately try to keep their wood under 25%. I understand this does not meet everybody, and a lot of people do burn wet wood, particularly folks that might have some economic disadvantage and not be able to appropriately store their wood. But what we're going to be doing is a approved EPA protocol that will rank all the stoves, and part of this is actually at the national level because of the impact of this problem on places like Alaska and California and other places that are in non-compliance with particulate matter due to residential wood heat. Like, it's not industry, it's not anything else, it's just due to wood stoves. And so they really need that list. My supervisor, Lisa Rector, is very expert in the regulatory realm regarding all that. But I do think from a scientific standpoint, the potential exists for catalytic cordwood stoves to possibly meet that 2 grams per hour. But as of today, I can't state that.
Thank you. I just put that reference of 2 grams per hour PM 2.5 as, I'm not sure that we're for the moment. Matt and then Rick.
I just want to reframe or summarize or try to understand better what we're being asked here. Are we being asked to determine whether or not to rule out the possibility of a chunk burning, a cordwood burning stove ever receiving credit under the clean heat standard, or to leave open the possibility that a future stove could be manufactured and marketed that could achieve those higher standards, and that we should leave the door open a crack for that to occur? Is that what we're being asked? Could I reframe that correctly?
Yes, option 3 leaves that option open.
Yeah, it would essentially exclude them for now, but leave open the possibility that they could be added in if we felt like we could have a health protective level of particulate emissions that could actually be reliable.
Okay, thank you for clearing that up. Thank you.
Rick?
Yeah, this is, option 3 does exactly that. The question I heard Jared asking was, are we willing, and Jared, you can correct me, are we willing to actually name the standard in the option? That's really what it comes down to. He was asking for more specificity. Just because we say that something needs to meet defined performance criteria, in order for that to be meaningful, we want those criteria to be meaningful I think, Jared, from your perspective, from a public health perspective. So that was the question I heard being asked.
And I would say that's relevant to both of these because each of them refers to meeting defined criteria without specification.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's implied in number 1. Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, do we want to name the minimum criteria that need to be met?
Sorry, I'm having a hard time finding where my hand went. I think you did phrase that well, Rick, and maybe I'm just reading that sentence in isolation too literally, because I saw the references to defined criteria above and I didn't see that reference in the cordwood appliances sentence. And so my very literal read was, once we figure out their emissions performance could be terrible, right, but we've determined it.
Yeah, it's not what it's.
And I don't think that's the intent.
It's not the intent, but the way these are written, it doesn't say what the minimum criteria would be, which may be fine, but maybe we want to say what the minimum criteria should be, at least as essentially a starting point.
And I think if it said meeting defined criteria here instead of this specific criteria, that could be fine, as long as, we have some reference for all of these for what those defined criteria are. Those have to be established somewhere.
Yeah, so that sentence would read, included until such time as their emissions performance meets defined criteria determined based on updated test methods.
No, that wouldn't be the way to put it, because the criteria are not defined as based by the test methods. The criteria are the criteria, right? The test methods will merely establish whether they meet the criteria. So
maybe Nora could help with the phrasing there.
Well,
I think, let me just interrupt briefly to say, option 2 and option 3 both refer to meeting defined criteria without specifying the criteria. The discussion below where you outline efficiency criteria, PM 2.5 criteria, a lot more information about what you refer to, Emily, as illustrative criteria, but you aren't proposing that. So I guess the question is, do we want to adopt those criteria below as the defining criteria and bring them up front and specifically into the options that we're presenting? Precisely.
That was exactly my point.
Floyd?
So I'm no wood combustion expert, but if I follow your logic, Catherine, and we specify what that criteria or that emissions level is, then what's the difference between option 2 and option 3? It seems like they kind of coalesce together at that point, right? I mean, if a wood-fired stove meets your specified criteria, whatever that emissions level is, it should be allowed to be to meet this standard or this definition. Am I missing something here?
I think you've got like one really good point, if I can just weigh in, and that is if you go to any retailer, or look up a stove online and look at their specification criteria, it's going to tell you it's under 2 grams per hour. But that's based on a testing method that EPA itself is saying is non-viable. So as of today, we have a testing method that's non-viable, that's been highlighted by the Inspector General as saying it's failing the intent of the statutes of the Clean Air Act, but it's still on the books, right? And there's still stoves out there that are going to state on their specification sheet that they're under 2 grams per hour because they used a method 3 years ago. And technically, there's even one today on the books that can do this. And again, that's that putting lumber in the stove. Stove manufacturers now are not required to use the integrated duty test method. It's all in flux. So this is, there's actually a big meeting this week that might.
Yeah, so thanks, Nora. So I think the distinction then is important that it's based on updated test methods. So that is the distinction between 2 and 3.
Correct. These issues will be resolved like within the next year on the test methods, but they are not resolved as of today. So the stoves that we've tested, which about like 25 of them, all have certification. They're all 2020 compliant to meet 2 grams per hour, but we have not identified one. We had some stoves emitting 20 grams per hour. That's
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think we've got that point, and I think that clarifies it for Floyd, I hope. Adam, you had one more thing to add here?
Yeah, just thinking that in essence, option 2 and 3 achieve the same outcome if option 2, you bake in the requirements of the efficiency. And so either cordwood meets it or it doesn't, but you haven't, unnecessarily closed the door to including it in the future. So I think they both get to the same outcome if the standard or the requirement, minimum efficiency and maximum emissions, are baked into it.
Not sure that's exactly what Nora said, but Rick.
No, the test method is what the problem is.
Nora, yeah, excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, no, Adam, Nora's point is that the testing methods today are not reliable, so that even if you have a cordwood stove that meets that purportedly meets the standard itself can't be assured through current tested methods. So I do see still a difference between 2 and 3.
Floyd?
So along those lines, so it sounds to me like option 2, the difference between option 2 and 3 is option 2 relies on current standards and test methods versus option 3 would rely on some specified criteria, performance standards that haven't been specified yet. I guess we're discussing that. But other than that, they're the same, right? If you meet those, whether it's the current standards under option 2 or this new set of standards under option 3, you should be able to qualify as an advanced heat wood heating.
Floyd, in both cases, I think it's fair to think about this. In both cases, the criteria would be the same. The only difference is that we don't have under 3, we're expressing a lack of confidence in one testing method. Okay, the testing methods or any testing methods associated with one technology. That's the only difference. And since those testing methods are deemed, or again, in number 3, are deemed to be unreliable, that technology will not be included as a clean heat measure unless and until a testing method is found that gives us confidence that the standards, that the outputs, that the actual emissions performance of the cordwood stoves is accurately measured.
Rick, you've summarized what I'm trying to say perfectly. And I guess if the tag is looking for really direct language, I would just say if it meets that criteria, performance of 2 grams per hour using the integrated duty cycle test method.
Thank you. Ken, we haven't heard from you.
Yeah, my understanding of this issue is that right now, in terms of the PUC implementing the clean heat standard, that cordwood stoves will not be included as creditable measures. Okay, and granted, this discussion lays out, okay, what will it take to get them to be creditable? But I think that the communication needs to be clear, not just to the Public Utility Commission, but also to the public, that as this clean heat standard is implemented in the year 2026, cordwood stoves will not be included. And then there can be that sort of commentary about what it's going to take. But that's how I differentiate 2 and 3 right now. Option 3 does not allow cordwood appliances to be eligible for clean heat credits.
Thanks. We need to take a break and want to just see where we are on this one before we do that. I'm not hearing, but I want to confirm, I'm not hearing any particular support for option 1. Is there anybody who wants to speak to option 1 and on that it should continue to be included and considered? Okay. We have 2 other options and a lot of discussion around those 2 options. Is there anybody who feels strongly that option 2, which would include wood stoves currently that are under current EPA certification, should also be included as a definition? Emily Roscoe.
Yeah, I think participating, as Efficiency Vermont and looking at consistencies within the clean heat standard and existing programs, I think I'm still leaning towards option 2, looking at option 2 being the most consistent with Efficiency Vermont's definition of advanced wood heat.
Okay. So we still have 2 options then. We have option 2 and option 3 to consider. And we want to go to public comment. I appreciate the public sort of hanging with us. We could take that public comment now and then take the break, since it's we've allowed only 5 minutes. If folks can bear with us for another 5 minutes. How's that, Rick? How are you feeling about that? Did we lose Rick? No, there he is.
Fine with me. Fine with me.
All right, let's take quick 5 minutes of public comment on these 2 issues that we've been discussing. Annette.
Yes, good morning. I just wanted to weigh in about the idea of excluding all cordwood. And I want to point out that this was an issue that was a topic of discussion as this legislation was being considered, and that the public was reassured that the clean heat standard would give credit for cordwood stoves. And so that just be aware that that was put out to the public. And so if you now choose to exclude that, it's not consistent with what the public was told by legislation as the legislation was being discussed. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I see Nick, you're next.
Thank you. You know, we've been talking a lot about EPA standards, their new source performance standard of 2 grams per hour. I wanted to make the point that this is not primarily a health-based standard. It is a technology-based standard. EPA sets the standard based on the degree of emissions limitations that the EPA administrator determines have been adequately demonstrated. They do take health into account in setting the standard as well as costs. But the point I want to make is that even wood-burning devices which meet the 2 grams per hour standard, they emit more toxic pollutants and fine particulates than other heating methods, including natural gas and oil and biofuels. And they pose much more of a risk to health than those other heating methods. So I really think, I don't think we should be incentivizing wood heat at all, because for starters, the greenhouse gas emission reduction benefits are, if they exist at all, only realized over a very long time period. And number two, they're just far worse than other heating methods from a public health standpoint, even if they meet EPA standards. I also wanted to comment, so I would ask you to adopt a restrictive definition of advanced wood heating. I also had a comment on avoided methane emissions. Should I save that for later, or do you want to?
No, yes, please save that for later. This is the other option, was the declining CI rate.
Thank you. And finally, just one last thing. Yes, pellet stoves are better from an emission standpoint, but when we're talking about pellet stoves, we should bear in mind that they're better from an emission standpoint because the pellets have been processed in an industrial facility, and those facilities are very problematic, have high emissions, and many of them are located in environmental justice communities. I think we should be taking that into account also. Thank you.
Thank you. Laura Height.
Hi, good morning. Well, I'm mindful that this is a really sticky wicket for you. The statute, however it might have been sold to the public, doesn't define advanced wood heating, and it does actually have a requirement for protection of public health. So to me, we argued that advanced wood heating shouldn't be included in this particular statute, in part because of the issues that NESCAM has raised, in large part. But there are these issues of equity and health and trade-offs on carbon emissions and PM 2.5 and other harmful air emissions. But I just wanted to say I agree with Ken that for ease of implementation alone, a very clear definition that just says no cordwood at this time will make it a lot less messy. And it's not like there aren't other programs available to provide incentives for wood heating. You've got the Efficiency Vermont programs, you've got the federal tax credits. So, this program should not be duplicating all of those existing programs. This program should be looking at what is the cleanest, what is the most likely to meet the climate goals. And even the wood pellets, the life cycle emissions are far greater than green ships. So this is why we wanted to be focusing more on weatherization. At any rate, good luck. And I agree with Ken that option 3 with a clear, no cordwood at this time will be the simplest and the most protective. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last hand I see is Pike.
Yeah, thank you. So I have some comments. It sounds like there'll be a second comment period, so I'll reserve some comments till later. And just speak about, yeah, the discussion that I've heard thus far. I'd like to second a couple of comments. Nick's comment about the health issues. Grams 1.8 or 2.0 grams per hour is safer than regular wood heating systems, just as going 90 miles an hour is safer than going 120 miles an hour. They're both very unhealthy. And I think that needs to be recognized. Just because you're meeting this 1.8 grams per hour condition doesn't make them healthier. I appreciate Ken's comment about clear language. I think that needs to be both in this place, this location, and elsewhere. I think the state has not done a good enough job about really clearly explaining the health impacts of burning wood, pellet stoves included, to the public. And they're promoting them without this clear understanding. And I think that's really, I won't even go there. So yeah, I'll reserve further comments later. I hope there will be a second chance. Thanks.
Yeah, there will be. Thank you, Pike. Okay, we need to take a break. We're considerably behind time. I'm guessing that what this means just, and I'll check in with Rick between the break as to how we're going to manage the time that the remaining issues on the agenda. But just to flag that, and we should come back 5 minutes. 5 minutes. All right. So that, according to my time, I'll give you 9:25. Oops, sorry, Mountain Time, 11:25. We'll reconvene. Thanks all.
And Catherine, can you stay for just a second? I wanted to mention something to you.
Sure. Everybody will be listening if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. They can take a break. But I just wanted to note that I did some wordsmithing of a possible hybrid of the declining CI, which I sent you in the chat. I just wanted to flag that for you.
Oh, good. I have not been checking.
In case that's helpful to kind of elevate.
Let me find it and make sure I've got it before you get off. For declining, here's a suggested revision. So this would be a fifth option, or option 5 as we've numbered them anyway. The PUC determines not later than January 2030. An alternative rate of decline. One alternative, for instance, is step function.
I think where this takes us, Catherine, is to a non-vote today. And as you say, we send off people to see if we can find acceptable line,
Right. Rather than introducing yet another thing that we haven't discussed. Agreed.
Yeah, I guess I was just, I guess I was thinking of this more as like a replacement for option 3 to make it a little bit more clear.
That would be fine. I'm just saying that if that's the case, we're not going to be voting today.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with that. I just, I'm not sure this is an entirely, I think this could probably replace one of the other options under consideration.
And we have also in the chat a proposed change in or proposed language for option 2 under our current advanced wood heat definition. So perhaps that will require more conversation before we take a vote on that as well. So let's take a break.
Hey.
Oh.
Mute yourself.
All right. If folks could just turn your cameras back on to indicate you're ready to continue the conversation. I don't think 5 minutes was quite enough. There we go. More. Emily's coming back in.
I'm here.
Yeah, bandwidth must be much improved if you can also do your video. That's great.
Yeah, it's as soon as you leave Vermont, much better.
All right. I'm going to turn it over to Rick to suggest some next steps here.
Thanks, Catherine. We've had excellent discussions on these issues, and new ideas have emerged from those discussions. So I'm going to take executive action here and say we're not going to do any polling on the options that we presented in the two documents that we've been talking about, because we've got, as I say, we've got new ideas and a real opportunity to improve the language of the options. So we will assign some tag members to work them over and provide to the full tag before the end of next week. We want to give you sufficient time to really review the documents, revised options, so that we can take up the discussion and polling at our next tag meeting 2 weeks from now. So that being the case, we'll just move on to the next two issues that we've got before us that we want to chat about.
Let me just check with Emily Roscoe. You had your hand up, Emily. Did you have a process question or?
I just wanted to note that Matthew had put some updated or some draft language
Yes.
from option 2, and I just wanted to make sure that was on the record and moving forward when we independently review language, if that could be incorporated, because I felt like that was an improvement.
Not so much on the record, but we'll make sure we grab it so that we have it for possible inclusion in the documents. Yes, thank you. Thank you. So with that, we will move on to a discussion of the treatment of land use change in biofuels, CIs, and the discussion of counterfactuals. We've now given it a different title, or the question of counterfactuals. We've given it a different title, avoided methane in this case, because in fact, we're talking about counterfactuals in both cases. And we will not be going to a poll on these either. Use the time we have, and we're going to give it about 45 minutes between the two to, as we did it previously, refine the options and the discussion. So Catherine, does that work?
Perfect. So I think we should turn it over to Floyd on land use change. And Floyd, would you like me to bring that up?
Yeah, please.
See if I can find
And thanks, Rick. I did
Sorry,
time this.
before we start on this, can I just ask if we're going to get to the public health and the wood heating conversations today, or if those are going to end up
We don't
punted?
know. We may or
Okay.
may probably not. I'd like to give some time to Jared to at least describe his memo. We don't have a memo yet from ANR. So we're not going to probably spend much time on it, given how much time we've already taken.
Okay, that's fine. Just wanted to check. Thank you.
All right, should be able to see it now.
Thanks, Floyd. Really appreciate your jumping in here.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so this is about treatment of land use change. And the question that was presented for this discussion, and hopefully you guys have all had a chance to go through it, is how should land use change be considered, if at all, for liquid biofuel life cycle carbon intensity scores? The reason this is specific to liquid and not liquid and gaseous is land use change has not been implicated as an issue for gaseous fuels, and therefore we thought it'd be appropriate to narrow it to liquid biofuels. And so the options before the tag for consideration is to exclude land use change as put in and suggested by Opinion Dynamics as their proposed approach. And then the second option would be to include it. And so just to recap the Opinion Dynamics approach, assume there's no land use change associated with biofuels that needs to be quantified. That doesn't mean there is no land use change, period, but none that needs to be quantified in the emission rates. And the land use change, their reasons for doing that are several. I've listed them here. Primarily, it's because the GREET carbon intensity accounting tool is inconsistent in how it treats land use change between the different biofuel feedstocks. The simplified assumptions outlined by Opinion Dynamics would result in a TRM that's easy to use and it's replicable and transparent. And then a third, the crop-based biofuels are grown predominantly in the Midwest. They're assumed to be grown on dedicated land for explicit use in the energy sector, among their other uses. And so those are the three main reasons they put out there. And then the fourth one would be uncertainty around the change in demand, either nationally or Vermont's contribution to that. Perhaps unlike the previous topics, this one does have a bit of statutory language to provide some guidance. So we listed that here. We did put in here and in some of the footnotes the exact statutory language for y'all for your convenience. The main themes, as I took it from the statute, is one is the legislative intent appears to be treat land use change retrospectively, look at it, after the CHS has been adopted and approved. And it's one of those potential impacts among many others that PUC is directed to take a look at biennially in their assessment under 8127H. Directing the PUC to biennially assess harmful consequences that may occur, and that includes environmental burdens, deforestation, conversion of grasslands, and so forth. So there's a clear intent to treat this as something that is on the minds of the legislature, not necessarily an intent to incorporate it into the regulation itself up front. I think that's in recognition of the inherent kind of uncertainties and difficulties of quantifying land use change. And then this is reinforced by 8127H, which is the review of consequences. I'm sorry, I skipped around. So 8128A3 specifies one of the duties of the tag to be periodically assessing and reporting on the sustainability of production of clean heat measures, considering a variety of factors, including land use change. So it seems that the legislature wanted the tag to look at land use change as part of its periodic assessment and reporting to the PUC of the clean heat measures, not necessarily incorporating it up front. That's reinforced by 8127H, review of the consequences, directing the PUC to biennially assess these potential impacts. The second, so there's a retrospective look. That's a key element of the legislative intent. The second one, I think, is just as important or even more important, which is the requirement that clean heat credits be based on accurate and verifiable life cycle CO2 emissions in the thermal sector. Verifiability means being able to confirm those impacts. And I think as we'll go through the discussion, by definition, land use change, especially the indirect land use change, is by definition not measurable. You cannot verify it on the ground, and therefore it would fail this test of verifiability. Let's move on. You can scroll down to the support for option one. So again, option one, I think is supported by the lack of explicit statutory requirement for upfront LUC incorporation. Nothing in Act 18 explicitly requires the clean heat standard to incorporate a land use change component. And in fact, the opposite appears to be legislative intent, which is to look at it retrospectively rather than prospectively after the CHS is adopted as one of those potential things that the PUC and the TAG are asked to look at and assess. The opinion dynamics rationales appear to be sound and reasonable for excluding it. As noted, the LUC, the land use change treatment, is inconsistent within the GREET model, making the inputs and assumptions consistent among the various biofuels will require substantial additional expenditure of public resources for little or no gain. Just to put some context to it, ILUC modeling or LUC modeling typically costs in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the sort of analysis that you're requiring. It requires specialized expertise in agroeconomics. It's highly uncertain, it's controversial, it's heavily dependent on the data and the assumptions and inputs, as well as the expertise of the modeler themselves in interpreting the results. And then finally, by nature, as I said before, you can't, there's no way to verify and confirm that a change in land use happening outside of the US is due to a change in policy occurring within the US. That's not the way these models work. The models tend to attempt to simulate behavioral changes on the global market in response to particular shocks in the global market. But again, those can be very different depending on the modeler, the type of model you use, and the assumptions and data that you use. Nevertheless, the land use change model that the California Air Resources Board uses, which is the Global Trade Analysis Project developed by Purdue, that has shown a substantial decrease in the estimated LUC over the years. And this is for a California and even West Coast scale sort of volume. So you're talking 3.5 to 5 billion gallons. When you compare that to Vermont's 100 million gallon total distillate market, it seems clear that Vermont's impact on the global scale, on the global market, will be, essentially negligible, and whatever LUC result you get out of the modeling would effectively be in the noise. There is a lot of feedstocks grown in North America, and certainly a lot more than what can easily be absorbed by Vermont's needs. And then finally, as I noted, inclusion of LUC would conflict directly with the requirements of 8127, which requires verifiability. And so I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll open it up to Emily to talk about option 2.
We lost Emily.
No, I'm only on a single screen, so it's just taking me a minute to navigate. Hang on one second. I gotta switch between documents. Yeah, I wanted, I guess I would first note that I don't think it's as clear-cut the statutory intention as what Floyd represented there. I mean, there's clearly a desire to look at land use change as a part of review of consequences, but inclusion of land use change associated with producing a certain biofuel using a certain feedstock, such as soy or corn, is a very standard part of life cycle analysis. So it's, I'm not sure there's a plain reading of the statute would lead you to decide that for some reason the legislature wanted to just exclude a standard part of a life cycle analysis procedure for some biofuels. So we can agree to disagree. I just wanted to note that I don't think it's as clear that it's the way Floyd represented it. can you turn that off, please? So in terms of, including land use change, like I said, I think this is standard. This is included in the California LCFS program. Opinion Dynamics noted that it wasn't inappropriate to include them. They just noted some complexities in doing so. One possible option would just be to default and use the CARB, low carbon fuel standard estimates, adders from California. We could just adopt those. That would be better than saying that land use change is 0. These are global markets for global crops. So, it's all marginal change. Even though Vermont is small, we are still, influencing global markets at the margin, just like California is. These are global markets for soybeans and canola and other crop-based fuels. So it would make sense that we could just kind of copy what California is doing. There are ways of doing this, and just because it's challenging to do doesn't mean it should be 0. Hang on, just going through. Sorry, I'm trying to do this on one screen in a moving vehicle. I also wanted to note, the requirement that in the statute that the emission reductions be verifiable. I also don't agree with Floyd's read of that. It's pretty standard in this type of life cycle analysis to group verification and validation together. Verification, can only be used when you have observable evidence. So, if you were to take a very strict reading of that, that would also include avoided methane, for example, which, like land use change, can only be validated, not verified. I think it's pretty clear that the legislature wasn't thinking about it in such a scientific way, and that standard validation practices would also be consistent for life cycle analysis, and would note that if you take a strict reading of this, then we're going to end up also leaving out avoided methane, which I personally support. But one thing that's been sort of interesting here is that the arguments for avoided methane and for land use change are somewhat in opposition. So, there's arguments for, we've got our pro biofuels perspectives arguing kind of in somewhat inconsistent ways for excluding land use change, but including avoided methane, which is a somewhat inconsistent position on several fronts, both landing in a place that's more favorable to biofuels. We can talk about that more. And, there are jurisdictions that are actually looking at increasing the land use change emissions. There's some challenges with the specific model that's mentioned. So, I think, again, this is a pretty standard practice. It's a standard part of life cycle analysis. We could just copy what California is doing. It doesn't have to be overly complicated. And, by excluding it, you're saying in effect that it's 0, and we know it's not 0. So, I also, something that came up earlier in the call, somebody, I forget who it was, it might have even been Ken, said, a lot of these fuels are going to have a pretty high carbon intensity anyway. And so, they're going to end up getting screened out. And that's actually not the case. A lot of them have a pretty low carbon intensity. I think they could very well end up out competing things like weatherization and heat pumps. And, if you exclude these land use effects, you're further making them look better from a carbon intensity perspective, and supporting them and outcompeting other things by leaving out a piece of their life cycle. I'll stop there.
All right. So I would ask that we give at least the amount of time, the first amount of time we have left, which is about 10 minutes max, maybe 6, to the non-subgroup members who have clarifying questions or comments. This has been debated at least over the course of one subgroup meeting, and I know we can go back and forth on it further, but I feel like this is an opportunity for the non-subgroup members to make sure that they understand the options being presented and the pros and cons. So let me ask, any non-subgroup members have a question here? All right, then let me ask any the rest of the subgroup members that were not the authors of this document, if you wanted to weigh in. and share your perspective. Rick?
Well, I'll just pick up on a theme that Emily alluded to a moment ago. I think to the extent that we can, we ought to be consistent about how we treat this broad group of counterfactuals, if that's the right term for it. Land use change is one, avoided methane's another. As a matter of principle, we should be consistent. That doesn't mean that necessarily that you end up in the same place with both, for reasons that both Emily and Floyd have expressed. It has to do with magnitude of impact or measurability, so on and so forth. I just have in the back of my mind something that the Public Service Board, now the PUC, said, boy, 30 some odd, more than 35 years ago about questions such as this. When assessing the environmental consequences of electricity generation back in the late 80s and early 90s, the PSB said that while it may be hard to assess what these damages are, just because we can't measure them doesn't mean they're not happening. Again, it's a question of magnitude, and I do agree that you've got to be able to measure them. And there would be a question of whether we actually can make estimates about what the impacts would be of Vermont's action relative to California's in these cases and others. So I do want to be methodologically consistent to the degree we can be, while nevertheless recognizing that we that you can still come out in different places on specific issues.
Okay, Matthew, and then Sam.
Unfortunately, this point doesn't really increase the clarity on the issue, but I wanted to make sure all the language relevant to this discussion is in front of everybody. In 8127, I believe it's J, the delivery in Vermont section of the Act says clean heat credits shall be earned only in proportion to the deemed or measured thermal sector greenhouse gas emissions reductions achieved by the measure delivered in Vermont. So that would tend to support the idea of estimating things that can't be precisely measured. And yeah, just thought that needed to be at least on the table so that people weren't looking at a restricted set of language.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Sam?
Thanks both for the presentation of this document. I guess the point that I wanted to make, and I know we have the avoided methane discussion upcoming, but I think that the big difference between these two topics is that we're really trying to drill down into what we think is actually associated with the feedstock production of the fuel. So while I appreciate the need for methodological consistency and certainly support that, I think there is a reason why we're arguing these two things in different ways, right? I mean, all of the evidence that I've seen on a very base level shows that this is not really contributing to land use change, right? In as far as U.S. feedstocks are concerned. And so, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot to be said there, but that's what I'm going off of. And that's why you'll see my different opinion on why avoided methane should be included. I think it's also, well, no, I'll stop there. I'll save it for the next one.
Floyd?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Sam. I did have a footnote in there. I neglected to mention it. If you look at the land use change modeling, a number of them say that significant land use change in response to these fuel policies around the country should have happened in the U.S. And in fact, that is not true. The yields of soybean and canola have increased without substantial change in the acreage. So right there, the models already are incorrect in terms of what's happening on the ground. And then with respect to the GTAP model itself, as I noted, there's been a downward historical trend as the science and the data underlying that model have continued to improve over the years, to the extent of a 95+% decrease in the land use change estimates coming out of these types of models from the early 2007, 2008, all the way to June of last year. You've seen numbers go from 300 to 60 to 29 to 9.1 to 9.7. So it's very clear that the science is continuing to evolve in a downward trend. The regulators have grossly overestimated the land use change, and in fact, what the models have predicted would happen in the U.S. has not happened. So that raises questions about that. My point being that one, following California, is not necessarily the appropriate thing to do for, other jurisdictions, especially when your fuel market is an order of magnitude at least greater than what you're faced with in this state. Number two is we are projecting growth in the yields, bushels per acre in the U.S. by 2030 that would result in 609 million additional bushels from the same acreage. That would equate to 900 million additional gallons of biodiesel and renewable diesel, far more than what would be necessary to respond to this program if you were to assume a complete displacement of petroleum distillate in this state. Again, reinforcing my point that, yeah, you could theoretically go through the exercise of a land use change model, but what would you expect to come out of that? Certainly, I don't think it's appropriate to use a California type approach, given the much larger scale of the volumes there. What you get if you were to put in 100 million gallons into that model, given that it's a global market of billions of gallons, I think we would all expect that the results would be in the noise. The other thing I would, if I may, this whole idea of land use change and avoided methane, and Sam and others can chime in on this. I wouldn't equate them as exactly the same or even similar. Land use change is not measurable, as I mentioned several times, whereas avoided methane is readily measurable. You can measure the amount of methane that would otherwise be released if it were not captured and turned into fuel. There are many studies, UC Davis, California Air Resources Board have done flux studies on lagoons that quantify those emissions. So I don't think they're even equatable. One is completely not measurable on the ground, whereas the other one, there's lots of data to show that.
Okay, Emily, I'm going to give you the last word on this, and then we are going to move to our next topic.
I just wanted to note that it's a bit more contested, I think, than what Floyd is sharing in terms of what California is doing. As far as I understand, California is actually looking at increasing estimates of land use change and has found evidence that land use changes are actually greater than what might have originally been assumed. There's also a track record. We know that there have been, palm oil plantations clear cut in certain parts of the world because of biofuels. And, this is like a real thing that happens. And I know Vermont is small, but we're talking about, assessing marginal impacts in global markets. And it's not clear to me that there's evidence that Vermont would have zero impact on that.
Okay. As Rick pointed out, we don't intend to take a vote on this. We want to just make sure that people fully understand what the two positions are and the pros and cons for each of those. So we're going to move now to the next topic, which is on treatment of now avoided methane in biofuels carbon intensities. And to give you a break for a moment, Emily, I'm wondering if Sam, you could start this off. I know Sam Ken and or Rick and Emily all had a piece of authoring this document.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I'm happy to. Is there any way that one of you guys could share it on your?
Yes, I'm going to be doing that momentarily.
Okay, thank you.
As soon as like Emily, I only have one screen, so it's very messy right now. Okay. There you go.
Thanks, Catherine. So I think, you know, in terms of options, this one is relatively straightforward. It's the question of whether or not we should include avoided methane emissions, which are, you know, a form of counterfactual in the life cycle accounting for biofuels where it's relevant. So we can, I think, skip over the background for now, and we'll go straight to the statutory language. And I'll just give the, you know, the inclusion side of this, and then Emily, if you want to come back and say something different, I think that would make sense. So we think that, you know, maybe a lot of this is a moot point because the statute reads as requiring the inclusion of avoided methane emissions. And I would highlight the text that says emissions baseline shall fully account for methane, ... captures, ... expected to occur for each fuel pathway. So I know you've all probably heard this already, but this has been interpreted by folks on the tag and otherwise to include avoided methane emissions and life cycle carbon intensities. So to me, that's the operable part of the statute. If you would mind scrolling down to the discussion, I'll go through the points that I have here. So first, I think the first point, which I know was added by Patrick, is, and I wish he was here to help comment on it, but is self-explanatory, right? It's basically saying that AD and the productive use of biogas prevent methane emissions in the agriculture and organic waste sectors, right? It's a proven method for that. So, you know, we know that it works. And I think really at the core of this, that concept is inextricable from what folks in the biogas field are trying to accomplish with these technologies.
By the way, Patrick is here. He joined.
Okay. Hey, Patrick.
And I've been listening for a while. I was on the move, so I had to call in first, but been here for a while.
Great. Well, nice to see you. Sorry, I didn't see your name. Okay, so the next point, we think that Vermont should basically follow standard practice unless there's a good reason not to. So the inclusion of avoided methane crediting is standard among all other LCA-based portfolio standard programs that exist in the United States, and to my knowledge, the ones that exist in Canada, right, which would include the Canadian Clean Fuel Standard. And so this is a really, really important point because, you know, given the market dynamics of those other life cycle based portfolio standard programs, if we don't include avoided methane emissions in this program, it'll basically cause Vermont to only incentivize purchase of landfill gas, right? So you're essentially saying, look, the program is going to go for the lowest hanging fruit in terms of RNG where it's applicable, and landfill gas is going to be that lowest hanging fruit because it's the cheapest technology to produce, and because essentially you're treating all the CI scores for the different feedstocks on an equivalent basis. So not to say that landfill gas isn't an important solution with methane capture and environmental benefits of its own, but this would essentially cause Vermont to forego an opportunity to affect even more impactful pathways. The other, it's worth pointing out, the other prominent venue which considers avoided methane is, I would say, the federal tax credit framework that's being, you know, currently implemented. Whether or not they decide to include avoided methane emissions, which I think there's, you know, a good chance that they will, that's a much different framework than a portfolio standard program. So, you know, to the extent that they were to take a different approach, it's not going to have the same market effect, right? We're creating a market for clean heat technologies that are being deployed in Vermont as part of this program. So the next point about reconciliation of program-based emissions. So these concerns regarding reconciliation, we'll put reconciliation in air quotes, of the life cycle emissions required by this program with state level inventories, Vermont state level inventory, have been brought up as a reason not to incorporate counterfactuals. I think it's, you know, really, again, important to understand that, first of all, whether or not we include counterfactuals or land use change, the program will include upstream emissions from these technologies. So this reconciliation will have to occur either way. There's no question about that, right? You're incorporating sinks and sources of greenhouse gas emissions that occur outside of Vermont's thermal sector in any version of this program. Furthermore, this is simply not an issue, right? Precedent already exists for doing this in every other state where they've implemented similar life cycle based programs. And so we shouldn't be worried about how to accomplish that in Vermont, right? Not to say that it's not a little bit complicated and will take a little extra work, but has to be done anyway. Next point, you know, there were some concerns raised regarding market distortion, right? And I think similar to the last point, we have to keep in mind that upstream emissions and sinks from these technologies will be considered under a life cycle framework no matter what. So the program target should be adjusted preemptively in any version of this program to account for expected life cycle emissions from fuels. Again, I don't see how that would be a reason to say we shouldn't do upstream methane reductions. So let's see, where are we? Providing value for upstream methane avoidance related to fuel production is also, I think, a very important piece of the puzzle for Vermont dairies. And Patrick, feel free to chime in on this if you have maybe a different opinion, but you know, implementing these biogas technologies is probably the most straightforward way for a lot of farms to be able to deal with their manure, reduce methane emissions, and have water quality impacts. And I think, you know, we're designing this program to include RNG. I'm not sure why we wouldn't want to incent that to the extent that we can, recognizing some projects will go to electricity generation because of their size, but there's all different types of business models out there, you know, for RNG and for biogas, which would be supported by the inclusion of avoided methane emissions. The other point here, and I think this one we hadn't addressed before under the group, I added this because it occurred to me that most of the conversation we've had here has been around the ag sector and avoided methane emissions from farms, right? But probably even more important in this, you know, discussion is organic waste diversion. So in terms of volume and in terms of total methane emissions that we can avoid through the implementation of biogas technologies, diverting organic waste from landfills is easily the biggest long-term impact that this industry is targeting to solve. And so again, if we exclude avoided methane emissions, we're just drawing in landfill gas from other states, most likely. I mean, I don't want to say that as a blanket statement, but that's the lowest hanging fruit. And we would be foregoing an opportunity to incent the technologies which are providing opportunities for organic waste diversion, which has not just methane impacts, but other environmental impacts. I should flag here, just for fairness, that Vermont does have an organic waste diversion law in the books. So this is actually a case where for organic waste diverted to an anaerobic digester in Vermont, you may not see a counterfactual emission, right? But this is still an important concept for the gas that would be flowing in from other jurisdictions which don't have organic waste diversion laws in place, which frankly is the extreme majority of other places. And I guess just important to point out, Denmark has used this strategy to achieve a landfill rate of less than 10%. Some estimates show 1%. I mean, it's an extremely effective strategy. Other states are doing it. California is the big example. So I can leave it there for now. Thanks for the opportunity to lay this out for you guys, and cue Emily for the exclusion points.
I assume, is that my cue to jump in?
Yes, please do.
And is my reception okay? It's getting a little worse, I think.
You're fine right now.
Yeah, so if you can scroll up to the legislative language, Catherine, just for a second. I just wanted to note again, I think there's different ways of reading the language that that Sam mentioned in determining the baseline emission rates. Shall fully account for methane emission reductions or captures already occurring or expected to occur as a result of local, state, or federal legal requirements. I think you could reasonably read that. Turn right here. Sorry, I'm navigating us to the last few turns. I think you could reasonably read that as, factoring in any legal requirements that you shouldn't be able to get credit for those. And so I just, again, don't think it's super clear, or it could be interpreted different ways. Okay, if you go back down to the other section, I just like taking a step back, what these avoided methane decisions are going to mean are whether if you include avoided methane, the result of that is you will end up with a negative carbon intensity for RNG. So what you end up saying is that RNG, like burning renewable gas, is actually a net benefit to the environment. And I just think that's kind of an illogical statement on its face. RNG is already, even if you exclude avoided methane, is already going to be very low. It's already going to be favored. It's already going to be incentivized. There's still going to be a reason to use it. But arguing that you should be able to get all these credits for avoided methane and therefore that you're actually having a climate benefit from burning this type of fuel, just kind of, it doesn't pass the straight face test to me. In terms of one of the things I've been struggling with, because I'm generally in favor of including counterfactual emissions, and that's one of the reasons we edited this to try to make it more clear that we're talking specifically about the avoided methane issue and not counterfactuals generally. I'm in favor generally of including counterfactual scenarios. So why then am I not in favor of included avoided methane? And the reason why is that it's sort of, I've used the word cherry picking. People felt like that was, not fair language to use, but you're counting like a piece of the agricultural emissions life cycle, which is, capturing the emissions from the manure lagoon, or the wastewater life cycle, capturing the methane from the waste, but not including all the other parts of those life cycles. So, the emissions there are not like intrinsically tied to the life cycle, the feedstock, like all of that. To me, you're sort of keeping the part you want and not including all the other parts of the life cycle. So that's sort of the difference I see there. I also think, the second point here is that there's a potential to have a really distortionary effect on the program. Again, you're not only like RNG is already going to be a very, low carbon intensity fuel. It's probably going to be eligible until 2050, even without including avoided methane. If you included avoided methane, suddenly it has a negative carbon intensity and it's going to outcompete, it could outcompete essentially everything else. And the interesting thing about that is that, those avoided methane emissions don't show up in our thermal sector greenhouse gas inventory. So we're going to have avoided methane, RNG outcompeting other clean heat measures in Vermont, but actually having no impact on our own inventory because those agricultural emissions are not happening in the thermal sector. So that leaves us with the issue of reconciliation. And I think, what is true for sure in like a state like California is that they have two sets of books. They have one set of books for their state greenhouse gas inventory and another set of books for their low carbon fuel sector program, their LCFS program, but low carbon fuel standard program. But what I think is not being done is really reconciling those, and that's what our program is going to require. Like if we end up giving all of these clean heat credits to RNG, where the credits then don't show up in our thermal sector, we're going to have to somehow acquire thermal sector reductions elsewhere, which could raise the overall cost of the program because we're paying for a bunch of credits that actually don't help us meet our thermal sector emissions as measured in our inventory, and kind of figuring out how to account for all that and make sure we get enough credits that actually count in our thermal sector. That's going to actually be kind of a tricky exercise, you know, and you know, is it sending the right signals to consider RNG like a climate positive thing compared to electrification and weatherization, which are going to have, you know, higher, like electric has a higher carbon intensity already. You know, I'm just not sure the clean heat standard is going to end up sending the signals we'd like it to have. This could end up being an extremely distortionary practice. You know, I personally think that it's not appropriate to include only part of the agricultural or waste life cycles here. And even though I am generally in support of including counterfactuals, if I lose that fight and we do think it's appropriate to include that counterfactual, then in that case, the question becomes, is the counterfactual just uncontrolled venting of methane to the atmosphere, or is it that it should have at least been flared? And there's a lot of, this is actually a conversation in GREET, thinking about updating GREET to assume that flaring is required, which is sort of a baseline practice to control emissions from landfills and farms. You know, should it assume that in the absence of this, the pollution is just pouring uncontrolled into the atmosphere, or at least there's some control? If it's flared, then it produces CO2 emissions instead of methane emissions. And that would cause the carbon intensities to no longer be negative, even if the counterfactual case were included. And to me, kind of what this comes down to is that, you know, you're taking a practice, a highly polluting practice of spewing, you know, uncontrolled methane into the environment and saying we should actually pay people for their right to pollute in perpetuity. And I understand, you know, like it could be helpful to a small dairy farm to get paid for that. They'd probably still be paid for that, even if we didn't include that, because again, RNG has a low carbon intensity and is going to be attractive as a clean heat measure, even without that. But it's sort of, it's kind of like, instead of requiring polluters to pay, it's actually paying the polluter. It's sort of a bad precedent to set. And it's arguable that the standard practice should really be like some sort of control of these emissions. We shouldn't be assuming a complete lack of control, even if there isn't a current law. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Emily. Yeah, and before I take any hands, let me just say we're out of time for these two topics. And the purpose of this session is not to have a debate back and forth. It's to present these two sides and make sure people understand them. I guess if you want to introduce a third option, that's another, but we will come back to this at our next meeting and have a much fuller debate. So just want to make sure people feel assured that they're not being cut off. But I just want to make sure that the hands up are for clarification of these two positions. Ken, you were first.
Yeah, it is clarification. Emily, you said that if you don't include, or you said RNG has a low carbon intensity value. If you don't include any methane, whatever the term is, how does it have a lower carbon intensity value than natural gas?
I don't know. I'm opening the spreadsheet. Maybe we could circle back to that.
Okay, open
I
question.
can answer that if that would be helpful, Ken. It's two things. First, the difference in emissions at combustion, where waste drive biofuels are treated as carbon neutral from a CO2 emissions perspective. That's a large impact. And then any other upstream emissions from processing and transporting the RNG are assessed in an equivalent basis as they would to fossil natural gas. So to the extent that there's improvements there from the RNG standpoint, that would also be reflected in the GREET model.
And actually that gave me time to open it up. So I'm looking at the Opinion Dynamics 2025 carbon intensities without including avoided methane. And natural gas has a carbon intensity. This is not a percentage, this is a grams of CO2e per megajoule. Natural gas is at 63.7. Biomethane from animal manure is at 15.1, and from landfill gas is at 6.8. From wastewater is at 37.6. So it's already like one of the most attractive biofuels by far, even without including all this avoided methane that would cause it to look like a positive climate impact.
Thanks.
you.
Sam, do you mind if I jump to Patrick and let him in first? In the interest of time. Patrick?
Thanks. I think first is I'll ask my clarifying questions, but just a suggestion that maybe we have another subgroup meeting on this. I think that there's several statements in here currently that are just inaccurate, and I think the tag should be making accurate statements. I totally understand and respect that we're not all going to agree, but I do want the tag to be making accurate statements, and I think we'll need some time to discuss how I have ideas on how to clarify things that can work for everybody.
Good suggestion. What's your clarifying question?
In this section you have up here, Catherine.
You want me to scroll up?
First, nope, right where you are in the first bullet point. I don't know what sentence it is, but it says, it's not the case, however, that the manure lagoon creating the emissions would not have existed but for the RNG clean heat measure in Vermont. The double negatives there are confusing me, and so I just don't understand. I'm looking for a little clarification on what that sentence is trying to say.
I'm looking for it, can't find it. Emily?
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to say again is that like whatever is going on with the manure lagoon is not intrinsic to the use of RNG as a fuel in the Vermont Clean Heat Standard. You know, it's like, it's just not, you know, it's, I don't know. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to explain it very well. Think about it a little bit more.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for clarifying. I'll save comments on that for another time. So and it's just sort of related to the next sentence. If the emissions from the manure lagoon are accounted for, then so should be all the other emissions. Sorry, I do understand what that sentence is saying. I guess the other clarifying is in the last bullet. The second sentence says, if these systems were required to flare their methane emissions, which is technically feasible, I guess, yeah, it's technically feasible, but they are not required. And I know I'm trying to clarify, not comment here, but Emily, you said it is baseline for farms to flare their methane, which is, I don't think, accurate. But what is your, since these are not required now, are you suggesting that they should be excluded because it's theoretically possible that someday in the future they might be required? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, basically just that it's a bad practice to pay people just because they've been releasing uncontrolled pollution and the law hasn't caught up to that.
Okay, I'll say the reason that's happening primarily is because there are laws which require them to manage their manure that way. And yeah, I'll save my comments for another time when we can discuss this more. Thank you.
Okay, back to you, Sam, and then Rick, and we need to close this up. I have public comment.
Thanks. This is a comment that I had during the ILUC discussion, but the criticism was made here that the biofuels advocates are pursuing inconsistent treatment of counterfactuals to favor biofuels. And I mean, I think it's extremely clear here that the other side of the coin is pursuing inconsistent treatment of counterfactuals to favor electrification technologies. And it's important to say that, if we're going to say that here. I have a ton to say in response, but I think we can save it for next week. Thanks.
Thank you. Rick?
I will just note once again that analytical consistency in this regard, I think, is a good thing. Again, it doesn't mean that you reach the same conclusions with respect to different counterfactuals for, as I mentioned before, you know, the specifics of each counterfactual. I'm wondering if, in fact, calling this avoided methane is not appropriate, because in those circumstances where the baseline is the avoidance of flared gas, then you're avoiding, then it seems to me what you're really doing is you're avoiding the introduction into the atmosphere of CO2 that would not be put to a productive purpose. Okay, so we may want to think about that.
So we've triggered several other hands. We really need to go to public comment instead of continuing to debate this. I appreciate that we've got a lot more to be said on both sides. But we promised the public a chance to weigh in. We're about to close out the meeting. Want to do that, and before we do that. So let me go to the public, and on these two issues that we've just discussed, are there public comments? Yes, let's start with Tristan.
Thank you. Just two quick comments, and it's really clarifications about some inaccurate statements that have been made. The first, life cycle assessment is focused on a system analysis, and I've seen a lot of conflation of indirect land use change with what's being called the avoided emissions aspect. Two are very, very different from a systems analysis perspective, especially from an LCA perspective. In the case of the avoided methane, you are taking a molecule that you know is being produced, methane, and you're instead redirecting it from going to the atmosphere, and you're using it to produce heat instead. So there is no uncertainty about what the ultimate fate of that molecule is, which is why it's considered part of life cycle assessment. Indirect land use change, won't get into that, but there's high degrees of uncertainty because that's kind of an unintended consequence when it does happen. So very, very different in terms of how that's treated. The second, there was a statement made that California does not reconcile its life cycle assessment under the low carbon fuel standard with its greenhouse gas inventory. It does keep two books, that is true, but it ultimately reconciles those two books. And so I think it's very important to make note, this is already being done. Other states are doing it as well. The two book system does not mean that you don't reconcile the two books. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Anthea?
Thank you. So CLF is appreciative of the work that it has done to design the Clean Heat Standard program so far, especially the debate and deliberation that the TAG is engaging in and will engage in. The decisions that the TAG makes at its next meeting, if implemented in the final version of the Clean Heat Standard program, will have a significant effect on whether Vermont can affordably reduce thermal sector emissions, and I'm underscoring thermal sector emissions here, through a Clean Heat Standard. CLF filed a written public comment on two of these options documents, the two that you just talked about, on Tuesday, and while it was filed in EPUC, it is really directed at you, TAG members, as you engage in your polling and votes and deliberation at your next meeting, and I would really encourage you to read it if you haven't already read it. I would like to note that, and this has been mentioned earlier in the meeting, that public comment references what we call the counterfactuals document that has since been more appropriately renamed the treatment of avoided methane emissions document, which you were just talking about. I'm not going to go through the points that CLF raised in that comment letter, all of which have been discussed today, but I'm going to go back to that earlier point I made, that the Clean Heat Standard and some of the complications with what reconciliation means and differences between what the low carbon fuel standard is doing and what the Clean Heat Standard is intended to do per statutory intent is really about reducing thermal sector emissions. It's not about encouraging practices in the agriculture industry or better treatment of waste emissions. It is about reducing thermal sector emissions in Vermont. Thank you.
Appreciate that. And Nick?
I just wanted to follow up on what Emily was talking about earlier. You know, when we're talking about emissions from the agriculture sector, the biodigesters only address the manure emissions. And the problem is that the emissions from enteric fermentation, the emissions that come out of the animals' mouths, far dwarf the emissions from manure. According to EPA, manure is responsible for 9% of methane emissions nationwide, enteric fermentation 25%. So we don't want to be providing incentives to practices that can increase herd sizes and could perversely even increase methane emissions. And when it comes to landfills, I think many of you know that federal law that requires landfills of a certain size to install landfill gas collection and control systems. So that's another reason not to recognize avoided methane emissions. Thank you.
Thank you. And Pike.
Yeah, I'm going to save my majority of my comments till next week when we get into wood and such, but I wanted to let you know that in the chat I put a link to a report commissioned by the state legislature regarding flooding. And I am going to reference that in my comments later. It'd be good for you to look at that and maybe Appendix C, because when we talk about alternatives to wood burning, you know, it shouldn't just be assumed that even if we do have something called waste wood, that the only option is, or the counterfactual might be, it's going to be burned. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for the public comment. And I think what time we have left, I'm wondering if I could ask Matt and Emily to put, if you would, your updates on the EAG into the chat for the tag to review. And that we leave the remaining few minutes just to give Jared and Brian a chance to give us an update on the two issues that they were asked to address. I think, Brian, for you, there's no document that you provided, so it's just how you plan to proceed. But I definitely want to give Jared a chance just to say what he hopes the tag should do with the memo you provided on public health implications, and we'll take that up in our discussion next week or 2 weeks. So, Jared, can I let you go first? Make sure you have enough time.
Sure. I'm wary of introducing new material at this point, and so I don't know if I quite followed that. I hope there's still an opportunity to go through it in more than 2 minutes.
No, yes, next meeting. I just wanted you to just introduce what it was and what you were hoping to talk about next time.
Sure. So what I circulated was 4 pages, one that summarizes the legislation with the tag duties related to health. The second page is some questions that Emily and I came up with, Emily Levin and I came up with for tag consideration, mostly about this topic of biennial assessment of various impacts. Health was in the list with other environmental impacts. I can just state right now, it seems odd to me to wait until 2 years down the road to flag potential concerns related to those topics. So it seems like we should be communicating some information now about potential harms so that those can be considered in decisions that are made. So I do want to flag that. And then the other tag duty is to quantify health impacts for the different measures, which seems way beyond the scope and the support of the available science. So I want to flag that and just ask questions of tag members of, you know, where do we go from here? And where I'm at with what I summarized on pages 3 and 4 was basically high level summaries of health pros and cons associated with some groupings of measures and delivered fuels, with some comment on how well that information is supported by the literature. There are a few things in there that can be quantified. There's a lot of uncertainty around things like biofuels and health impacts. I think it's more straightforward what impacts there are related to electrification of heating systems or appliances, around weatherization, and other sort of building envelope improvements, and wood heating. And at the very end, I did flag a couple of questions about, are we talking about life cycle health impacts? Because there are life cycle health impacts. I tried to focus in my brief review on impacts to Vermont, either at the home or, in terms of emissions within Vermont. Their equity considerations, and I think the last one was about backup power considerations, because I think there are some health considerations as well. I think that's outside the scope of what we're working on, but I wanted to flag them. So that's where it's at. It's a pretty high level summary. There's a lot of weeds out there, and I don't want to get into them any further without some input and direction from the TAG.
Thank you. And we will have, I promise, a much fuller discussion of this. Brian, could you give us an update? I know you got answers to some of the questions you were waiting for just this week. So what would be your hopeful next steps on some of the questions on wood combustion emissions?
Yeah, so as you acknowledged, Opinion Dynamics updated their treatment of the emission factors for wood, and we just got it earlier this week. So we're needing to revise our deliverable, and it's going to need to go through some internal review. So, and I think that I'm glad that the discussion of the advanced wood heat or the voting on advanced wood heat was tabled to the future, because I think they do interface with each other well. So that's a positive outcome. And yeah, I'm working internally across a couple of, across the agency, with a couple of the departments on, revising our comments related to the, the now latest proposal for how Opinion Dynamics is going to treat the emissions from wood heat or wood fuels. When's the next meeting? Are we doing one next week?
No.
The next thing to discuss.
2 weeks.
Yeah, the next thing, in 2 weeks. The next full.
Right.
I would just jump in on that cue, Catherine, to say that to offer to the TAG that you and I will go through the list of to-dos and send out a memo, whether we actually need a subgroup meeting next week to resolve some of these issues is a question in my mind. There's certainly some to-dos, having, rewriting some of the options, adding language, and so on. So we'll think about how best to do it, how most efficiently to do it. And if we think we need a meeting, we'll let you know right away. If we do, it'll undoubtedly would be the same time next week, but let's think that one through. And obviously, if members have thoughts, please send them along, or to Catherine or me and Emily as the leadership, or just give me a call, or give any one of us a call. That'd be fine. Does that sound right, Catherine? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, and just to note that one of the big issues we deferred was discussion of the PUC draft rule. So that is still there. And we heard from Deirdre, we have till the end of the month, or end of November, excuse me. Was that right? The end of November?
I think it's November
1st.
November 1st, the end of this month. Whew.
Means at the next meeting.
And thank you, Emily Roscoe, for putting in the EAG report, where they have already started to discuss that rule, and really appreciate, give folks a minute to read it. It doesn't look to me that there is a specific ask of the TAG yet in the moment, but want to make sure that we don't slough over that if there is anything that the TAG needs to specifically respond to.
Nothing to respond to, but the EAG did want to flag that piece reacting to the draft rule for the TAG, just for your review.
Emily, do you mind emailing this around or Catherine? Because I'd love to have this to put in my notes. And I don't think I can get it out of the chat.
You can copy, you should be able to copy and paste it, but
I
try
just
it.
typically
No,
I
you- I
did
don't
try
think you can
that and it
copy.
didn't,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well,
I guess
quite
maybe
let
only
me.
I will do that.
yes, can you say the chat? There's also some language from Matthew that we want to take a look at.
Yes,
So
I always automatically get the full chat, including anything we say to each other, just so you know.
That can or will be used against you, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Louis?
thanks, Emily, and thanks, Catherine. That'll be really helpful.
yes, Emily Levin. And then
Just in
Luce.
terms of next steps, I did want to just make sure we spend like 30 seconds talking about next steps on the rule review and because I think we were going to try to tee that up for future discussion, but there's like, yeah, the challenge is it's taking the tag a lot of time to get through things, and we're now missing the deadlines requested of us.
Well, look, we're going to talk about the rule next week in our next meeting, and that's Halloween. It seems, I mean, we did tee this up, at least the obvious question, it seems to me, is whether there are, what I want tag members to consider about the draft rule is whether the draft itself raises issues that the tag has been tasked to deal with. I'm not sure that the rule itself does, but that's a discussion to have. We certainly, I mean, obviously, if tag members come back in 2 weeks and say, you know, A, B, C, X, Y, Z, we need to comment on, then we will have a challenge. This may be something that will inform a decision to have a subgroup meeting next week. But I do strongly encourage tag members to review the draft rule and consider whether it, as written, raises issues of, well, technical issues that we've been tasked to deal with, that we're not dealing with.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Luce.
Hi, just a quick question. We've gone over a lot today, and at the beginning you talked about where we should send comments, and I just want to be really clear about, as tag committee members, what would you prefer? You want it to go to EPUC, or do you want it to, where do you want that?
Someone was speaking. Who's
That was Matt. I just muted him. There was background noise.
was background? Well, you want to now, if you want to send comments on the documents we've been discussing, Luce?
Right. I mean, should we all send them just to you and you compile them like some on the equity would, you know, what's the best way to do this? I'm just trying to be efficient.
Send them to Catherine, and we will compile them, and we will use them to inform any redrafting of the documents.
Okay, thank you.
And I think Deirdre was saying, if you have an official position that you want to share, it should go through the EPUC system.
Absolutely.
For, you know, for your organization.
But if this is meant to inform the tag's work and then come back for full deliberation of the tag, send it to Catherine.
All right. So with that, I think thanks for hanging on an extra 8 minutes. And I believe we're ready to adjourn. Chair?
Can I ask one quick question?
Yeah, sure.
This is Matt. So we're not planning on having a meeting next Thursday. I know I'm sorry, I'm getting lost in my meeting dates, but the tag will not meet as a full group next Thursday. I know we talked about doubling up in October. No.
I don't think so, but we could have a subgroup meeting. It seems to me. I don't think so. If people would rather that we do that, we'll plan for it. We can make that decision within the next 24 hours.
Well, is there, can we just do that right now? I mean, is there, we have had a request for an additional subgroup meeting from at least one individual. That would give that subgroup a chance to revisit some of the documents that were just provided at, today, or this week, and have not had thorough discussion. So that's one option. if we have another tag meeting next week, we won't have any time to necessarily prepare for that with additional information. That's my only concern. I just raise that. Ken?
Yeah, I was curious about the opinion dynamics piece that I just got yesterday. And I don't know when, maybe I was supposed to get it earlier, but they went through an awful lot of our suggestions and had reactions that I think we have reactions to. I know I have reactions to. I'm not sure if that's appropriate, if there's some product that we would develop as a tag that would then ultimately inform their next iteration. I don't know, but there was a lot there. And because it gets to this big topic of characterization, credit characterization, which I think is our responsibility, and I still think we're far from accomplishing. So that would be something. Again, the product exists. We could get ready. We could get ready for that for next week, because yeah, there's still so much work to be done. And if we're gonna really, yeah, I think we need to dedicate the 2-week meeting to the specifics of reaction to the rule, where I would encourage everyone to put their reactions in writing, and so we could then deliberate over those reactions, so we can get a product to the PUC by November 1st. So I think we should have a meeting next week.
A meeting of the full tag?
Yes, to go over the opinion dynamic, at least to go over the opinion dynamics responses on the credit characterization work. Credit characterization, carbon intensity, their work.
Okay.
Which would not preclude also having a subgroup meeting. I'm just saying we could have both if people have the bandwidth, but.
Just to quickly state for the record, I'm not available next Thursday, so I can try to share some thoughts beforehand. That's totally fine if everyone else wants to meet, but just I'm increasingly concerned about just the timing issue, and I do think Deirdre mentioned at the beginning of this meeting that we might have to extend, that the PUC might consider extending some of opinion dynamics deadlines. The issues we're actively discussing around avoided methane and accounting for land use change and eligible measures and things like that actually have, and also carbon intensity of wood, like there are proposals, but they also haven't had a chance to fully integrate whatever it is the tag is going to recommend. And so they're either going to have a final version of the TRM and the carbon intensity of fuels that are out of sync with a tag recommendation, and that just might be inevitable, or there could be some further delay to attempt to align those two products further, but that's a challenge just timing wise.
Okay, it sounds like we ought to have a meeting next week. Those of you who can make it, great. We'll gin up an agenda in the next day or so, and let's have it.
Yeah, and considering that this is being put on people's schedule at the last minute, I would just maybe say that we would not have any tag-wide votes on that meeting. That would be for discussion purposes of those topics, the rule and the questions. But there will be no votes. We'll defer all votes to the regular meeting.
Good idea.
Okay. All right. All right, good enough. I will get a calendar invite out for next week. And we can talk about a subgroup meeting if needed, and turn that around pretty quickly too.
Yep.
All right,
Thanks.
thanks.
Really appreciate it.